The clock on the mantel ticks, not with the urgency of modern life, but with a steady, rhythmic heartbeat that seems to measure the passage of seasons rather than seconds. It is the year 1900. Outside, the world is poised on the brink of a new century, caught between the echoes of the Victorian age and the hum of an industrial dawn. But inside this house, the air is thick with a different kind of transition. Have you ever wondered what happens to the silence in a home after the last laughter has faded from the hallway? We are so often told the stories of grand journeys of those who leave to conquer cities or cross oceans, but what of the ones who remain? What of the mothers who stood in the quiet doorways, watching the horizon where their children had vanished, and then turned back to a house that had suddenly grown too large, too still, and too full of memories? Tonight we step back into that quiet space. We are not here for wars or revolutions. We are here for the soft, unrecorded history of a life rearranged. Imagine the scent of beeswax and dried lavender, the low light of a kerosene lamp casting long, comforting shadows across a kitchen table that no longer needs to be set for 6, but only for 2. As the children move into the world, the mothers of 1900 didn't just grow older, they grew into a new version of themselves, a version that found peace in the rhythm of the everyday. Close your eyes, let the weight of your day dissolve. You are entering a time where the pace of life was dictated by the rising sun and the turning of the page. Here in the gentle dusk of the 20th century, we explore the art of letting go, the beauty of the quiet routine, and the profound grace found in the changing seasons of motherhood. The channel Sleepy History with Kevin is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional values. As the last carriage pulled away from the gate, carrying the final child toward the bustling promise of the railway station, a profound stillness settled over the house. It was not a heavy silence, but rather a soft, velvet-like quiet that seemed to fill the corners of every room. In the year 1900, a home was a living, breathing entity, and its pulse was tied directly to the feet that pattered across its floorboards. Now, those feet were gone, bound for apprenticeships, marriages in distant towns, or the endless opportunities of the growing industrial cities. For a woman in the early 1900s, the rhythm of the day had always been a symphony of urgent needs. There was the fire to be built before dawn, the porridge to be stirred, the mending of shirts that seemed to tear as quickly as they were sewn, and the chaotic, beautiful noise of children navigating their youth. Now the kitchen felt different. The stove, once the frantic centre of the home's energy, glowed with a steadier, more reserved warmth. Walking through the hallway, the mother might notice how the sunlight hits the dust motes dancing in the air, a sight she rarely had time to observe before. The wallpaper, once covered in the scuffs and marks of growing children, now seemed to hold its own history, a faded map of heights recorded in pencil on the doorframe. There is a specific kind of beauty in this transition. It is the realization that the house is no longer a site of constant repair, but a space of preservation. She moves to the larder, her hands performing the motions of cooking out of muscle memory. Before pausing, she realizes with a gentle start that she no longer needs to prepare the extra portion of bread. This small mundane adjustment is the first step into a new chapter. It is the quiet reclamation of her own time. In this era, when duty was the bedrock of a woman's identity, this shift was not viewed as a loss of purpose, but as a subtle evolution of her role within the community and the home. The laundry, once an overwhelming mountain of fabric, now becomes a manageable, even meditative task. The water flows, the soap suds rise, and the linens are hung to dry in the breeze, flapping like white flags of peace against the backdrop of an afternoon sky. The world outside continues its rapid march toward modernity, but here there is an invitation to breathe, to linger over a cup of tea, and to listen to the soft creaking of a house that is finally, after so many years, learning to rest. With the sudden expansion of hours in the day, the landscape of a woman's life in 1900 began to shift outward. When the constant demands of childhood receded, the fences that had once felt like protective barriers against a busy world started to feel more porous. The garden, once a place where she had to keep a watchful eye on playing toddlers, slowly transformed into a sanctuary of her own design. In the late afternoon, when the sun dipped low, casting long, amber fingers of light across the vegetable patch, she found herself working with a new kind of intention. The planting was no longer just about providing enough food for a growing family. It became an act of patient cultivation. She tended to the rose bushes with a gardener's steady hand, pruning away the dead weight, much like the way she was learning to prune away the habits of her previous life. The scent of damp earth and crushed mint filled the air, a sensory grounding that anchored her in the present moment. It was during these quiet hours that the rhythms of the village became more apparent. She would hear the neighbour calling to her over the low stone wall, not with the urgent requests of emergency, but with the leisurely invitations of camaraderie. These exchanges were the social fabric of the era. Tea was shared. Stories of the changing season were exchanged, and there was a newfound space to discuss the local news or the subtle shifting of weather patterns. She discovered that her role in the community was evolving. Without the constant tether of child rearing, her expertise in domestic management, her knowledge of canning, sewing, and herbal healing became a quiet resource for those around her. She was no longer just the mother of those children. She was becoming an individual with a voice and a history of her own. She began to spend more time mending the quilts, not because they were torn, but because the intricate patterns allowed her to contemplate the passage of time. Each stitch was a deliberation, a slow meditation on the life she had lived and the life that lay ahead. The house, while quieter, was becoming a container for a different kind of fullness, a collection of thoughts, a library of memories, and the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent in deliberate, measured activity. The rush of the 20th century was approaching, but inside her garden, under the watchful gaze of the shifting clouds, time seemed to hold its breath, allowing her the space to simply be. As the evenings grew longer and the shadows deepened within the parlour, the connection to those who had left became tethered to the arrival of the post. In 1900, the written word was the lifeline of the family. The act of writing a letter was a solemn, deliberate ceremony. She would sit by the light of a single lamp, the nib of her pen scratching against the paper, capturing the small, quiet details of home that her children might be missing in their new lives. She wrote of the harvest, of the changing colour of the leaves, of the health of the neighbour's cow, and of the way the light hit the kitchen floor at mid-morning. These were not grand updates, but they were the anchors of identity. For her, the act of putting pen to paper was a way to maintain the thread of intimacy that distance threatened to fray. She wasn't just sending news, she was sending a piece of the home's stability, a reminder that no matter how far they travelled, the hearth remained warm and waiting. Occasionally she would open a small wooden chest, a repository of treasures accumulated over the decades. Here lay the baby shoes long outgrown, a ribbon from a daughter's first day at school, a carving made by a son's hands in his youth. Holding these objects, she felt no sharp sting of grief. Instead, there was a profound sense of continuity. She understood that motherhood was a cycle, a passage from total dependence to independent flight. These items were not burdens of the past, but evidence of a task well performed. The transition from a home filled with active duty to one filled with quiet reflection allowed her to see her children as adults. She began to appreciate them not as extensions of her own care, but as individuals navigating their own paths. This realization brought a new kind of freedom, the freedom to let them go completely, trusting in the foundations she had laid. She would fold the letter, seal it with wax, and leave it by the door for the morning post. The task was done. She would then walk to the window and look out into the darkness, not with longing, but with a quiet, contented acceptance of the expansive, unfolding mystery of their separate lives. All stories on this channel Sleepy History with Kevin are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historical themes and inspired by real events, figures, and periods, reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals, actual events, documented cases, any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is purely coincidental. The transition into this quieter era brought with it a discovery that many women of 1900 found surprising, the gift of solitude. For so many years, their sense of self had been woven tightly into the fabric of others, the needs of the children, the expectations of the spouse, the demands of the household. In the stillness that now defined her days, she began to find a rare, unhurried space to reclaim her own thoughts. She might spend an hour simply watching the rhythmic patterns of the fire or observing the slow transformation of the landscape through the seasons. She found that her own mind, once crowded with the noise of daily survival, now bloomed with a new kind of clarity. It was a time of internal expansion. She began to read more, perhaps opening an old book that had gathered dust on a shelf, finding words that resonated with the silence she now lived within. There is a profound comfort in realizing that you are enough, just as you are, in the quiet of an empty room. This shift towards self-reflection was not an act of selfishness, but a necessary gathering of strength and wisdom. She learned that silence was not an absence, but a presence, a deep, grounding force that allowed her to observe the world with sharper, more appreciative eyes. If you are finding peace in these quiet stories of the past, we invite you to become a part of our community by subscribing to Sleepy History with Kevin. You join a circle of listeners who appreciate the gentle rhythm of history and the soothing power of a calm, reflective narrative. If this story has brought a moment of stillness to your day, please consider liking this video and sharing it with someone who might appreciate a quiet escape. Your support helps us continue to craft these gentle journeys through time, ensuring that the quiet, unrecorded moments of our history are honored and shared. As she sat by the window in the twilight, watching the first stars appear, she felt no pressure to rush toward tomorrow. The night would come, the sun would rise again, and she would meet it with the same gentle grace she had cultivated in the silence. She had learned to dance with the rhythms of her own life, discovering that even when the house felt empty of people, it was full of a quiet, beautiful peace. With the passage of time, the house itself began to reflect this new chapter. Without the frantic daily wear and tear of a bustling family, objects in the home could finally hold their place without the threat of being moved or broken. She found herself attending to the house with the care of a curator. The polishing of the mahogany side table was no longer a chore performed in a rush. It became a ritual of appreciation. As the cloth moved in circular motions, she could see the reflection of the room appearing in the wood, a deep glowing surface that held the warmth of 100 sunsets. She began to organize her domestic life, not for efficiency, but for serenity. The linens were folded with such precision that the edges lined up perfectly, a small satisfaction that brought order to her mind. She rearranged the parlour, moving the armchair closer to the window where the morning light was brightest. This was her space now, a place where she could sit and listen to the birds outside, or watch the leaves turn from the vibrant green of summer to the brittle golden hues of autumn. It was also a time when she rediscovered the value of the things that filled her life. A chipped porcelain cup, once perhaps a source of mild frustration when a child bumped it, now became a piece of history. She remembered who gave it to her, the tea party where it was first used, and the laughter that had filled the room that afternoon. Each object in the house acted as a silent witness to a decade of joys and challenges. This act of tending to the home was, in essence, an act of tending to her own soul. By preserving the beauty of her surroundings, she was honouring the life that had been lived within these walls. The house was not becoming a museum, it was becoming a sanctuary of reflection. She would walk from room to room, touching the surfaces of the furniture, feeling the sturdy wood and the cool stone, finding comfort in their permanence. In a world that was beginning to move faster, where steam engines and new technologies were promising a future of speed and complexity, she found a quiet rebellion in the slow, deliberate care she gave to the simple artifacts of her life. The clock on the wall continued its steady, reliable tick, no longer marking time as something to be rushed through, but as something to be savoured, moment by gentle moment. As the seasons turned, the boundaries between the interior of the house and the natural world beyond the threshold seemed to grow thinner. In the early 1900s, life was intrinsically connected to the cycle of the earth, and without the constant distraction of a busy household, she became more attuned to these subtle shifts. She learned to read the sky like an old friend. The colour of the horizon at dusk told her whether to expect a frost, and the specific rustle of the oak leaves in the wind warned of an approaching storm. There was a profound sense of liberation in this observation. She began to take longer walks, not because she needed to run errands in town, but simply to witness the beauty of the changing world. She would walk to the edge of the woods where the wildflowers grew in hidden pockets, their colours muted and earthy. Sometimes she would bring back a bundle of dried grasses or a few sprigs of evergreen to place in a vase, bringing the outside world into her quiet parlour. Nature in its own way mirrored the transition she was undergoing. She saw how the trees shed their leaves in autumn to conserve energy for the winter, a period of necessary dormancy. She saw how the buds returned in spring, representing the promise of new life that follows every period of rest. It was a gentle lesson in acceptance. She came to understand that her current life was not an end, but a season of her own, a time for internal growth, for quiet reflection, and for the restoration of her own spirit. When she sat on the porch during these golden afternoons, the sounds of the countryside became a comforting symphony. The distant hum of a honeybee, the soft whistle of a breeze through the grass, and the occasional song of a bird hidden in the eaves. These sounds were not interruptions, they were the heartbeat of the land. She found that her own breathing slowed to match this pace. The anxiety that often plagued the young, who were constantly striving to build their lives, began to lose its hold on her. She was no longer building, she was existing in the beautiful, unfolding present. Each day was a soft gift, and she accepted it with a heart that had grown quiet enough to hear the whisper of the wind and the slow, steady rhythm of the passing years. Within the gentle solitude of the late afternoon, her hands found their most faithful companion, the needle and thread. In the year 1900, the domestic arts were far more than mere chores. They were a meditative practice, a silent language spoken through fabric and pattern. As she sat by the bay window, the soft, diffused light of the setting sun illuminated the intricate work before her. She was finishing a quilt, a patchwork of memories crafted from the remnants of years gone by. Each stitch was deliberate, a slow movement of the wrist that required absolute focus. This was a time when the mind could wander, unfettered by the demands of a chaotic household. She would think of her children, now grown and navigating their own vast worlds, and with every pass of the needle she felt a sense of peace wash over her. It was as if she were stitching together the lessons of the past with the tranquillity of her present. The rhythmic in and out of the thread became a heartbeat, a steady cadence that slowed her own pulse and cleared the fog of worry. Have you ever found peace in a repetitive, quiet task? Perhaps for you it is the act of gardening, the steady stroke of a paintbrush, or the simple act of writing in a journal. We would love to hear about the moments that bring you the most stillness. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Reading your reflections is a beautiful way for all of us to connect in this shared space of quiet history. If this moment of calm has resonated with you, consider subscribing to our channel Sleepy History with Kevin and hitting the notification bell so you never miss our next journey into the peaceful echoes of the past. Your interaction helps our community grow, allowing us to continue creating these tranquil, reflective experiences. As the needle worked its way through the fabric, the room grew dim, but she didn't rush to light the lamps. She enjoyed the transition of the light, the way the world softened at the edges. She wasn't just mending a quilt, she was mending her own soul, piece by piece, stitch by stitch. The house remained silent, but it was a warm, living silence, a container for her thoughts and the quiet, steady rhythm of a life that had finally found its own perfect tempo. With the house quiet and the evening hours stretching out before her like a long velvet ribbon, she rediscovered the joy of the written word. In the years when the children were small, books were often snatched in fleeting moments, a few paragraphs read between tending to a fever or stirring a pot. But now she could open a book and lose herself completely in its pages. She would retreat to the small reading chair in the corner of the parlour, draped in a woolen shawl, and travel to distant lands through the grace of literature. The stories she read felt different now. She found herself relating to the characters with a depth that only comes from having lived a full life. She saw the nuances in the prose that she had missed when she was younger, finding comfort in the wisdom of authors who understood the weight of time and the beauty of human endurance. It was a form of companionship that transcended the physical boundaries of her home. When she finished a chapter, she would often look up and gaze out the window at the night sky. In 1900, the darkness was absolute, unpolluted by the encroaching glow of electricity that would soon transform the cities. The stars appeared as bright, piercing diamonds against a deep, infinite velvet. She would sit for long minutes, watching the slow movement of the constellations, feeling the vastness of the universe. It was a humbling experience, one that put her own life into a perspective of quiet grandeur. She realized that the changes she was experiencing, the departure of her children, the quiet of the halls, the aging of her own hands, were merely part of a much larger ancient rhythm. She was a single thread in a vast woven tapestry of time. This thought brought her no sorrow. Instead, it offered a profound sense of relief. She felt a kinship with the generations of women who had sat in these same quiet hours, looking at the same stars, finding solace in the same silence. The house was not just a shelter from the elements, it was a vantage point from which she could observe the elegant, slow rotation of the world. She would eventually close her book, place a bookmark made of a pressed leaf between the pages, and blow out the candle, welcoming the darkness, not as an absence of light, but as a space for deeper, more restorative rest. As the weeks turned into months, she noticed that the concept of the end of the day had shifted. It was no longer a time for exhaustion, but a time for gratitude. She began to keep a small ledger, not for household accounts or debts, but for the quiet wonders she encountered during the daylight hours. It was a simple record, the way the morning mist clung to the orchard, the kindness of a neighbour who brought over fresh apples, the sight of a bird nesting in the eaves. This practice of observation transformed her perception. She learned that by consciously looking for these small pockets of grace, she could cultivate a landscape of peace within her own mind. The world might be rushing toward the complexities of the 20th century, but she had carved out an island of stillness where the pace was dictated by the turning of a page or the blooming of a flower. We hope that through these episodes you are also learning to find these quiet islands in your own life. The history of the everyday is often the most profound, for it is in the ordinary that we find our shared humanity. If you have enjoyed this journey and wish to continue exploring the gentle side of history, please subscribe to Sleepy History with Kevin by becoming a part of our channel. You support the creation of content that values stillness, reflection, and the quiet beauty of the past. If this series has brought you comfort, please share it with a friend who might also need a moment of tranquility in their busy day. Your engagement is the lighthouse that guides our work, helping us reach those who seek a peaceful refuge in the noise of the modern world. As she looked back at her entries in the ledger, she realized that she was not waiting for her life to resume. She was living a life of depth and deliberate presence. The transition of the children leaving had not emptied her home, it had opened it up, creating the space required for her to truly see the beauty of the life she had built. The house, in its hushed evening glow, seemed to breathe with her, a partner in this gentle practice of existing in the present. She felt complete, a woman who had navigated the storms of parenthood and had now reached the calm, serene waters of a life reclaimed for herself. The transition from the height of summer to the crisp promise of autumn was a reflection of her own internal landscape. She stood on the threshold of her doorway, watching the golden leaves descend, each one a testament to the natural cycle of growth and release. There was no resistance in her heart, only a deep, resonant understanding that everything in its own time finds its way to completion. She had raised her children with the same care she gave to her garden. She had provided the soil, the water, and the protection, and now, like the fruit falling from the bough, they were nourishing a world of their own. In this quiet life, she discovered that the passage of time was not a thief, it was a sculptor. It had carved away the unnecessary noise, the frantic pace, and the anxious striving of her earlier years, revealing the refined, steady figure of the woman she was always meant to be. Her days were a tapestry woven with the threads of small, meaningful acts, the warming of a hearth, the writing of a letter, the quiet contemplation of the stars, and the simple act of listening to the house as it settled into its own rhythm. She often thought of the future, not with worry, but with a sense of wonder. She knew the world would continue to change, that the horses would eventually be replaced by machines, and that the silence of the countryside would one day be filled with the hum of a different era. But that was for the future. For now, she held fast to the present. She possessed the luxury of time, the time to think, the time to observe, and the time to be truly present with herself. As she returned inside and pulled the door shut against the cooling air, she felt a profound sense of home. It was no longer defined by the people within it, but by the peace she carried in her own spirit. She had become the architect of her own quietude. She turned down the wick of the lamp, allowing the room to soften into a warm amber glow. There was a unique, unhurried grace in these years, a quiet power in the ability to sit still and let the world revolve around you. She was, in every sense of the word, at peace. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. Winter arrived with a soft, persistent silence that draped the world in white. For the woman in our story, this was not a season of coldness, but a season of deep inward turning. As the landscape outside became a vast, featureless canvas of snow, the interior of the house became even more defined in its warmth. The hearth, once a mere utility, now became the literal and metaphorical centre of existence. She spent hours simply feeding the fire, watching the dance of the embers, and listening to the rhythmic crackle of the wood, a sound that seemed to synchronize with her own heartbeat. The world outside felt distant, as if wrapped in a thick blanket of frost that muted the clamour of the century. She observed the way the light reflected off the snow, casting a soft, blue-hued glow into the rooms, a light that was gentle on the eyes and calming to the mind. It was during these long, dark evenings that she truly appreciated the value of solitude. She didn't feel lonely. She felt protected, enveloped by the stillness of the season. She spent time engaging in tasks that required patience and foresight. She mended garments that had been set aside for months, enjoying the tactile sensation of the fabric, the wool, the linen, the soft cotton. Each thread pulled through the cloth was a reflection of the patience she had cultivated. She had moved past the stage of life where everything was urgent. Now she moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace. If a task took all day, it took all day. There was no pressure of deadlines or the impatient demands of growing children to satisfy. In this quiet seclusion, she found that her memories were not ghosts, but visitors. She would sit in her chair, the warmth of the fireplace pressing against her back, and recall the faces of her children as they were in various stages of their lives. But unlike before, these memories were no longer tinged with the longing for the past. They were simply stories, pleasant narratives that she could visit and revisit at her leisure. She held these images with a sense of immense satisfaction, knowing that she had played her part in their growth, and now they were living their own stories, just as she was living hers. The house remained steady, a fortress of calm amidst the silent winter landscape, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the simple, quiet life she had reclaimed for herself. In the heart of the winter season, as the frost etched intricate fern-like patterns upon the window panes, she found herself drawn to the objects that had anchored her family for generations. These were not merely household items, they were silent companions, keepers of the domestic timeline. There was the heavy iron mortar and pestle that had belonged to her grandmother, a tool that had crushed countless herbs and spices, releasing the sense of home across decades. There was the hand-carved rocking chair, its wood smoothed by the touch of 3 generations of weary souls. She spent a quiet morning cleaning these heirlooms, treating each piece with the reverence one might afford a sacred text. As she wiped away the dust from the heavy oak dresser, she felt the ridges and knots in the wood, mapping the history of the piece with her fingertips. This was a tactile connection to those who had come before her. It reminded her that she was part of a lineage, a chain of lives that had all navigated the same transitions, the coming of children, the departing of children, and the inevitable return to the self. This work of preservation was a grounding force in a world rapidly modernizing, where the new was celebrated and the old was often discarded. Her commitment to these humble objects was an act of quiet defiance. She was keeping the stories alive. She realized that the house was not just a container for her own life, but a vessel for the collective memory of her people. By midday, the sun broke through the grey clouds, casting a sharp, brilliant light into the room. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, creating a shimmering atmosphere that felt almost ethereal. She stood back to look at the room. It was not pristine or sterile. It was lived in, loved, and deeply authentic. The air felt heavy with the contentment of a space that was truly cared for. She understood then that her legacy was not necessarily in the great things she would leave behind, but in the small, consistent acts of grace she performed every day. The simple act of keeping things whole, of honouring the past while gracefully inhabiting the present, this was her true work. She sat down, her hands resting in her lap, and allowed herself to be fully submerged in the quiet dignity of her home, feeling the weight of the past supporting her, and the lightness of the future beckoning gently from the window. The deepest stillness of the day always arrived just before the first light of dawn. She had taken to waking before the sun, finding a peculiar beauty in the transition from the velvet black of night to the soft, bruised purple of early morning. In these moments she was not a mother, not a neighbour, and not a woman defined by her duties. She was simply a conscious being, witnessing the daily rebirth of the world. She would walk to the kitchen, her footsteps soundless on the wooden floor, and light a single candle. The flame was a small, defiant flicker against the encroaching dark, casting a warm, golden pool of light on the table. She didn't rush to start the fire or prepare the coffee. Instead, she sat in that pool of light, simply watching the shadows pull back from the corners of the room. It was as if she were participating in the creation of her own day, choosing to let the light in slowly, with intention. This was her most cherished freedom. When her children were young, the mornings were battles against time, getting clothes on, food in bellies, and everyone out the door before the world fully stirred. Now the morning was an invitation. She observed the way the light crept across the floor, highlighting the texture of the rugs and the grain of the floorboards, revealing details she had been too hurried to notice for 20 years. She realized that this level of awareness was a luxury she had earned through decades of service. Her mind, once scattered like chaff in the wind, was now settled and clear, like water in a still pond. She thought of the world beyond her windows, the towns waking up, the factories starting their whistles, the rush of people beginning their frantic commute. She felt a deep, quiet empathy for them, but no desire to join them. She had found her own rhythm, one that hummed in tune with the earth rather than the machines. She picked up her tea, the ceramic warm against her palms, and let the rising sun hit her face. The cold air of the room was chased away by the heat of the cup and the growing warmth of the morning. She felt a profound sense of sovereignty. Her home, once the stage for 1,000 little dramas of upbringing, was now a sanctuary of deliberate, peaceful existence. She was no longer waiting for the next phase of life. She was living the current one with absolute quiet perfection. The day was hers to define, and she greeted it with a faint, knowing smile, ready to spend these precious hours in the company of her own growing, deepening spirit. As the weeks drifted by, the quietude of her home was occasionally broken by the gentle arrival of friends, women of her own generation who were walking the same path of transition. Their visits were not marked by the high-pitched energy of young children or the complex arrangements of family gatherings. Instead, these encounters were characterized by a serene, unhurried pace. They would sit on the porch or in the cozy confines of the parlour, the air filled with the soft clink of teacups and the muted sound of shared reflections. They spoke of the changing landscape of their lives with a candid grace. There was no need for pretense or the performance of endurance. They understood the nuances of the silence that now defined their households, and they discussed it not as a loss, but as a newfound territory to be explored. One friend might speak of the joy of finally finishing a long-neglected project, another of the peace she found in the solitude of her garden. It was a circle of quiet empowerment, a shared recognition that they had entered a season where the focus had finally shifted back to the individual. Their conversations often drifted into the realm of memories, but these were not heavy or nostalgic in a way that caused pain. They were light, like dried leaves caught in a gentle current. They laughed about the trials of early motherhood, the sleepless nights, the frantic meals, the endless cycle of mending and cleaning, and the laughter was seasoned with the wisdom of hindsight. They were survivors of the storm, now resting on a calm shore, and they recognized in each other the strength it took to reach this point. Watching her friends depart, their figures retreating down the garden path, she felt a profound sense of connection to her community. She realized that while she had spent many years building her life around the needs of others, she was now surrounded by a network of women who were also rediscovering their own centers. They were not alone in this quiet transition. They were moving through it together, linked by the shared history of their past and the shared serenity of their present. The house seemed to settle back into its rhythm after they left, the echoes of their gentle laughter lingering like a pleasant scent in the air. She felt bolstered, held by the unspoken understanding that this stage of life had its own quiet nobility. It was a realization that made her solitary hours feel less like isolation and more like a chosen peaceful retreat, a space where she could continue to grow, to reflect, and to savor the beauty of being truly and wholly herself. The winter had been long, a necessary pause in the grand cycle of the year, but the first whisper of spring was finally in the air. She noticed it first in the way the light stayed just a little longer in the evenings, painting the room in shades of soft amber instead of the stark, grey twilight. There was a subtle change in the temperature, a thawing of the frozen soil outside that seemed to resonate deep within her own chest. She opened the window, the fresh, damp scent of awakening earth flooding the parlour. It was a smell that promised renewal, a promise that, despite the cold and the dormancy, life would always find a way to reach toward the sun. She felt a corresponding stir of energy within herself, a desire to plant, to nurture, and to participate in this quiet unfolding miracle. She walked out into the garden, her boots pressing into the soft, yielding mud. The dormant rose bushes she had pruned so carefully were showing tiny, emerald-green buds, small points of light against the brown stems. She touched one gently, marvelling at the resilience contained within such a tiny form. It was a reminder that even after the most quiet and still times, there is a pulse that beats underneath, waiting for the right moment to emerge. This anticipation of the season mirrored her own internal state. She wasn't the same woman she had been when her children were still under her roof. That version of herself had been a whirlwind of motion, a protector and a provider. But the woman she had become, the woman who had learned to appreciate the silence, the slow passage of time and the deep quiet rhythm of the earth, was perhaps more fully realized. She was now a woman who understood that life is not just about the rush of production, but about the quality of presence. As she looked across the garden, she saw the first crocus pushing through the mulch, a bright splash of purple against the muted landscape. It was a small, defiant act of beauty. She stood there for a long time, not needing to do anything, not needing to be anywhere else. She was simply a witness to the changing world, a participant in the slow, inevitable movement of time. The house behind her felt warm and inviting, a sanctuary of her own making, but for this moment the garden was enough. She had learned to breathe in the air of the present, to find joy in the smallest budding things, and to trust that the coming season would hold exactly what it was meant to hold. There was a sense of profound readiness in her, a quiet, steady strength that would carry her through whatever the year might bring. The world beyond the village was changing with a swiftness that was occasionally whispered about in the market, or overheard in the brief exchanges with the postman. They spoke of horseless carriages, of wires that would soon carry voices across miles, and of cities that grew taller by the day. Yet for her these developments were like ripples on a distant lake. They touched the surface of her awareness, but they did not disturb the deep, quiet waters of her daily life. She watched a modern mechanical clock on a neighbour's mantel one afternoon, and realised with a sense of relief that she preferred the steady, imperfect tick of her own grandfather clock. The modern device moved with a precise, clinical efficiency that felt restless. Her own clock, with its slight variation in tempo, felt like a living thing, breathing in sync with the house itself. She realized that she did not need to keep pace with the world. She only needed to stay in rhythm with her own conscience and the land she lived upon. This choice to remain out of time was not a result of ignorance, but of conscious curation. She had spent years responding to the demands of a fast-paced household. She now understood that the speed of life is often a choice, not a necessity. By choosing the slow path, she preserved her capacity for wonder. She could still lose an entire morning watching the light move across the kitchen tiles, or spend an hour contemplating the complex architecture of a spider's web in the corner of the porch. These were not trivial pursuits, they were acts of resistance against a future that promised to be increasingly hurried. She found that the more she simplified her surroundings, the more expansive her internal world became. She was developing a kind of intellectual independence that the younger version of herself, buried under the weight of immediate duty, had never had the luxury to cultivate. She was reading deeper, thinking more critically, and feeling more profoundly. Sometimes she would sit in her chair and look at her hands, hands that had worked tirelessly to raise her children, to keep the house, to tend the garden. They were weathered, perhaps, but they were also steady. They were the hands of a woman who had navigated the most important tasks of life and had now earned the right to choose how to spend her remaining years. She felt no pressure to embrace the new for the sake of novelty. She felt entirely grounded in her own history, a woman firmly rooted in the soil of her own making, completely at peace as the 20th century spun its complex new threads around her, while she remained perfectly, elegantly still. Even as she grew accustomed to the quiet, there were moments when the house felt the fleeting, joyous invasion of a return. A son or a daughter might arrive, carrying the frenetic energy of the city in their clothes and the weariness of their ambitions in their eyes. They came back seeking something they could not name, but which she had cultivated in abundance, the stillness of the hearth and the absence of expectation. When they entered, she did not rush to adjust her life to theirs. She did not fall back into the role of the busy matron, frantically cooking and cleaning to prove her worth. Instead, she offered them exactly what she had found for herself: the permission to simply sit, to breathe, and to let the noise of the world recede. She became a mirror for them, reflecting back the peace they had forgotten how to access. There was a profound reversal in their relationship. Once she had been the one to provide all the answers, to soothe every fear and mend every scrape. Now she was a quiet presence, a listener who held their stories without needing to judge or direct. They would sit together in the kitchen, the sunlight filtering through the curtains, and she would listen to them speak of their struggles with the new century, the pressure of work, the complexity of their social circles, the yearning for a meaning they couldn't quite grasp. She realized then that her quiet life was a gift to them as much as it was to herself. By remaining centered, by refusing to be swept away by the current of progress and anxiety, she was providing them with an anchor. When they left again, departing back into their own lives, they went with a little less heaviness. She had shown them that it was possible to exist in a space of grace, that life did not always have to be a race. Watching them walk away down the lane, she felt no heartbreak. She knew that they were on their own paths, navigating the necessary challenges of their generation. She felt a deep, warm pride, not just in their achievements, but in the fact that they knew where to come when the world became too much. She was the hearth fire that remained lit, a constant steady flame that offered no pressure, only the warmth of unconditional acceptance. She returned to her quiet parlour, sat back in her chair, and felt the house wrap its silence around her once more like a familiar, protective cloak. The cycle was complete. She had raised them, she had let them go, and now she was witnessing the beauty of their becoming, all from the serene vantage point of her own reclaimed soul. As the months accumulated into a year of this new quiet rhythm, she began to experience time not as a series of tasks to be completed, but as a vast, unfolding landscape. The rigid lines of the calendar, which once dictated the harsh constraints of her life, began to blur at the edges. She no longer felt the need to measure her worth by the amount of work she performed before the sun set. Instead, she measured the quality of her life by the depth of her attention. She found herself becoming a student of the small details. She noticed how the shadows in the kitchen shifted their positions with an elegant mathematical precision throughout the day. She observed how the wood of the house sighed and settled when the evening temperatures dropped, a language of its own that she had learned to interpret. These were the conversations of a home that was finally at rest, a structure that was no longer being pushed to its limits by the boisterous demands of a growing family. There was a profound, almost spiritual connection in this intimacy with her surroundings. She realized that she was not separate from the world outside, but a deeply integrated part of it. When the rain tapped against the roof, she felt its rhythm in her own breathing. When the wind whistled through the eaves, she felt its restlessness in her own thoughts. She had moved beyond the need to control her environment. She had entered into a partnership with it. She would often sit in the garden during the golden hour, watching the light catch the fine hairs of the seed pods, illuminating them like strands of spun gold. In those moments, she felt an immense sense of humility. She understood that all things, the seeds, the trees, the house herself, were part of the same grand, ancient process. This realization brought an end to the last lingering vestiges of restlessness. The anxiety of what she might have missed, or the worry about what might lie ahead, simply evaporated into the cooling air. She was exactly where she needed to be. She was the witness to her own life, the guardian of a sanctuary she had crafted from the remnants of her past. She had discovered that the greatest wisdom was not found in the acquisition of knowledge or the accumulation of experiences, but in the capacity to be entirely present in the here and now. Her home was filled with a peace that was palpable, a heavy, velvet, soft presence that welcomed her every time she stepped over the threshold. The clock ticked on, not as a reminder of what was lost, but as a steady, reassuring heartbeat of a life that was finally, perfectly her own. In this late stage of the season, the house seemed to grow quieter still, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation of the beauty that follows total stillness. She had reached a point where the distinction between her own spirit and the walls surrounding her had become remarkably thin. The house was no longer a structure of timber and stone, it was an extension of her own memory, a physical manifestation of every joy, every trial, and every quiet victory she had ever known. Walking through the rooms at dusk, she felt a profound sense of companionship with the space. The floorboards, polished to a dull, warm sheen, held the imprints of years of pacing, of dancing, and of standing still in contemplation. The furniture, worn at the edges and softened by time, seemed to hold the echoes of past conversations, a chorus of laughter, the soft murmur of lullabies, and the steady hum of a life well lived. She felt no desire to change a single thing, for every mark and every soft indentation was a testament to the life that had been carved into the very bones of the dwelling. She realized that this was the true reward of a life dedicated to the domestic arts, the creation of a sanctuary that could hold the fullness of a human spirit. She had spent her younger years pouring herself into the lives of others, and now the house poured that love back into her. It felt like a warm, protective embrace, a constant reminder that she had done her work well. She had built a foundation that could withstand the passage of years, a place where the soul could retreat and find itself again in the mirror of its own history. There was a singular, quiet power in this. She was not fading away, she was ripening. She saw the sunset through the window, the colours shifting from deep orange to a bruised, beautiful violet, and she felt the same colours stirring within her own mind. She had learned the secret of the ages, that when you stop trying to push against the flow of life and instead learn to drift with it, you find that you are exactly where you're meant to be. The house was dark now, save for the faint glow of the moonlight bleeding through the panes, bathing the room in silver. She sat in her favourite chair, her breathing slow and rhythmic, matching the quiet pulse of the night. She was at peace with the shadows, at peace with the silence, and at peace with the infinite expanse of the stars watching over her humble, perfect world. With the arrival of a new gentle morning, she found herself reflecting on the nature of what remains behind. In a world that was so obsessed with building monuments of steel and brick, she realized that her own contribution was far more subtle and perhaps more enduring. Her legacy was not written in stone, but in the atmosphere of the house itself. It was the lingering sense of safety, the quietude that seemed to soak into the very walls, and the memory of a space where a human soul was allowed to simply be, without the constant pressure of becoming something else. She walked from room to room, touching the surfaces of the life she had curated. She understood that, long after she was gone, the house would hold the memory of these quiet years. Someone else might walk these floors, someone else might sit by the hearth, and they would perhaps feel, without knowing why, that they were in a place where peace had been practiced. She had become an architect of stillness, and that was a quiet, potent power. This realization brought with it a sense of deep, resonant satisfaction. She had fulfilled her duties, she had loved, she had served, and she had raised those who would carry her values into the next century. But more than that, she had succeeded in the most difficult task of all. She had reclaimed her own spirit from the demands of the world. She had shown that a woman's life, even when it retreats from the public eye, is not a life of withdrawal, but a life of expansion. She took a seat by the window, the soft light of the morning sun warming her hands. She thought of the future generations, of the daughters and granddaughters who would one day navigate their own turbulent worlds. She hoped that in their own time they would find their way to their own version of this quietude. She hoped they would realize that the race they were running was one they could choose to step out of, that the noise of the world was something they could mute whenever they chose. She felt a soft, tranquil joy. The house was humming with the quiet energy of a life that was complete, a vessel that had served its purpose and was now content to simply exist in the light of the day. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to mend, and nothing left to fear. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the soft rustle of the wind in the trees outside, feeling the steady, unbroken rhythm of the earth beneath her feet. She was fully, utterly at home, within her house, within her own skin, and within the vast unfolding mystery of the life she had so beautifully, so deliberately lived. As the evening light deepened into the rich, bruised hues of twilight, she stood at the doorway, looking out toward the horizon where the sun had long since slipped away. The stars were beginning to emerge, pinpricks of ancient cold light that seemed to watch over the rolling fields with a calm, eternal indifference. She felt no shiver, despite the encroaching chill. She was anchored by a warmth that lived within, a hearth fire that no wind could extinguish. She thought of the journey she had taken from the clamour of a life defined by others' needs to the serenity of a life defined by her own presence. It was a passage not through distance, but through depths. She had travelled inward, peeling back the layers of duty, expectation, and fear, until she reached the core of her own existence. And what she found there was not emptiness, but a vast, silent capacity for peace. The house behind her seemed to sigh in the soft breeze, a sound of profound contentment. She understood now that this was not a place of isolation, but a station of grace. She had created a sanctuary where the spirit could breathe, where time was not a master but a gentle companion, and where the rhythm of the world was perfectly mirrored in the rhythm of her own heart. She turned back to the room, the single lamp casting a gentle, welcoming glow. She would spend these final hours of the day, as she had spent so many others, in quiet gratitude, in deliberate observation, and in the simple, profound act of being present. She had nothing more to ask of the world, and the world, in its infinite, revolving complexity, had nothing more to demand of her. She was complete. As she blew out the candle, the room surrendered to the soft silver embrace of the moonlight. She lay down, feeling the steady, supportive weight of the bed, the familiar scent of lavender and dried linen comforting her like an old friend. The house was silent, but it was a living, breathing silence, a container for all the love and the quiet work that had transpired within these walls. She drifted off, not with the worry of tomorrow, but with the peaceful confidence that she had lived this day, and every day before it, exactly as she was meant to. In the vast woven tapestry of time, she was a single golden thread, shimmering quietly in the dark, perfectly, beautifully at rest. The morning after that night of profound rest brought a clarity that she had never quite touched before. It was as if the boundary between her own conscious mind and the memories embedded in the house had dissolved entirely. She moved through the rooms not as an occupant, but as a part of the house's own history. Every creak of the floorboard, every shift in the light, felt like a silent conversation between her and the decades that had passed within these four walls. She began to spend her afternoons in the attic, a space she had once viewed as a mere storehouse for the discarded. Now she saw it as an archive of her own becoming. She opened old trunks, not with the intention of cleaning or organizing, but with the curiosity of a historian exploring a long-forgotten civilization. She found ribbons from her children's hair, bundles of letters tied with fraying twine, and the dried petals of flowers pressed into books, each object an anchor point in time. Holding these items, she realized that she was not just remembering, she was integrating. She was recognizing that the woman who had cried over these letters, the mother who had braided those ribbons, and the girl who had gathered those flowers were all still present within her. They were not past selves, they were the layers that composed the woman standing there in the soft, dusty light of the attic. She sat on a low wooden crate, the silence of the rafters surrounding her like a sanctuary. There was a profound freedom in this realization. By acknowledging every version of herself, she had ceased to fear the passage of time. If she was the sum of all these moments, then time was not something that was being taken away from her. It was something that was being continuously added to her. She spent hours in that space, listening to the wind outside as it played through the eaves, a sound that felt like the earth itself breathing. She understood then that her retreat into this quiet life was not a withdrawal from the world, but a deepening into the very essence of human experience. She was witnessing the transition of her own life from the active, busy verb of doing to the serene, resonant noun of being, and in that stillness she felt a joy that was sharp, clear, and utterly complete, a joy that needed no audience, no applause, and no confirmation. She was simply, finally, entirely herself. With the turning of the season, the landscape began to shift once more. The air carried a different weight, heavier, more fragrant with the scent of damp earth and coming growth. She found herself spending more time on the threshold between the house and the garden, as if waiting for a change that she could feel in the very marrow of her bones. She observed the way the birds returned, their movements frantic and purposeful, yet they seemed to belong to a rhythm that was entirely harmonious. She realized that she had spent too long thinking of her own stillness as something separate from the world's activity. Nature did not see the world as a dichotomy of doing versus being. A flower does not do the work of growing, it simply allows the sun and rain to move through it. This realization changed her perspective on the hours she spent sitting in her chair. She was not waiting for anything to happen. She was participating in the unfolding of the day. She was the witness through whom the world experienced its own transformation. When the wind blew, she felt it. When the light changed, she saw it. She had become an active part of the garden's life, just as much as the soil and the trees were. One afternoon, she watched a spider spinning its web in the corner of the porch. It worked with a methodical, unceasing grace, weaving threads that were almost invisible, yet strong enough to hold the weight of the morning dew. It did not rush, and it did not doubt the structure it was creating. It simply followed a pattern that was older than its own memory. She felt a kinship with that small creature. Her own life, she realized, was a tapestry of similar threads, small, consistent, and woven with an intention that she was only now fully beginning to understand. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, bringing with it a sense of renewed vigour. The quiet, which had once felt like a hollow space, now felt like a wellspring. She had stopped trying to reach for the future or hold on to the past. She was anchored in the centre of the current, perfectly balanced, perfectly aware. The house remained silent, but it was a silence full of life, a silence that hummed with the quiet, steady strength of a woman who had finally learned to move in perfect harmony with the tides of her own existence. In the cool, soft light of an early morning, she decided to plant a sapling in the centre of the garden. It was not a grand, flowering ornamental, but a simple oak, a tree that would take decades to reach its full height, long after her own steps had ceased to grace these paths. It was an act of profound optimism, a declaration that she was still a part of the future, even as she savoured the slow, quiet present. As she dug into the earth, her hands grew stained with the dark, rich soil. The physical exertion felt good, a grounding weight that pulled her thoughts away from the ethereal and back into the tangible reality of the land. She worked with the same patience she had cultivated in her solitude, clearing away the stones, loosening the hard-packed clay, and tucking the young roots into the warmth of the ground. She realized that for most of her life, everything she had planted, metaphorically and literally, had been for someone else's harvest. She had nurtured her children to leave, she had maintained the house for her family's comfort, and she had gardened to provide for their table. This tree, however, was different. It was for no one but the garden itself, for the birds that would eventually nest in its branches, and for the simple quiet joy of witnessing something grow alongside her own aging spirit. When she finished, she stood back, wiping her hands on her apron. The sapling looked small and vulnerable against the vast open sky, yet it stood straight, its tiny leaves shivering in the breeze. She felt a sudden, sharp clarity. Her life was not a closed chapter. Even in this season of stillness, she was still contributing to the story of the earth. She was still a force of growth. The house seemed to watch her from behind, its windows gleaming with the reflection of the rising sun. She felt a deep, resonant connection to it. The home that had sheltered her through the storms was now sheltering her through this season of quiet, thoughtful expansion. She walked back toward the porch, leaving the sapling to its own slow, steady work of reaching toward the light. She had done enough for today. The rhythm of her heart felt synchronized with the slow, deep pulse of the oak's roots reaching into the dark, hidden places of the world. She had finally learned that one did not need to run to be moving. One did not need to speak to be heard. One did not need to produce to be significant. She was here. She was rooted, and for the first time that was more than enough. There were days when the silence felt so thick she could almost touch it, yet it was never the silence of emptiness. To an outside observer, her life might have seemed lonely, a woman alone in a house that once echoed with the clamour of a family. But she knew the difference between the ache of loneliness and the richness of solitude. Loneliness was a hunger, a craving for external validation. Solitude was a feast, a state of being where she was finally in communion with herself. She spent the afternoon observing the house as if it were a living creature. She noticed how the light moved across the walls, tracing the path of the sun with an accuracy that no clock could ever replicate. She listened to the house's small private noises, the rhythmic expansion of the timber as the afternoon warmed, the faint melodic whistle of the wind through a loose shingle, the soft settling of the foundations into the earth. These were not just noises, they were the heartbeat of her companion. She had spent so many years trying to fix the house, to keep it pristine, to ensure nothing was broken, to bend it to the needs of the family. Now, she simply allowed the house to be what it was, aged, lived in, and authentic. She stopped fighting the small imperfections, the scratches on the table, the fading paint. In fact, she began to cherish them. They were the scars and lines of a life that had weathered everything. Sitting in her chair, she felt a profound sense of sovereignty. Her mind, once cluttered with the lists of the day, the meals to cook, the clothes to mend, the errands to run, was now wide open like a meadow after a long winter. She could hold a single thought for hours, examining it from every angle, watching it transform and evolve. She was no longer a vessel for others' needs, but a fountain of her own creativity and reflection. As dusk began to settle, blurring the sharp lines of the furniture into soft, comforting shapes, she felt a wave of gratitude. She had not come to this place of peace by chance. She had earned it. She had walked through the fire of duty and emerged into the cool, clear air of self-possession. She didn't need the validation of the world to know she was enough. The house in its silent, steady presence whispered this truth back to her. She was not alone. She was exactly where she belonged, in the company of the only person she had spent a lifetime trying to truly know herself. As the spring deepened, she found herself drawn to the objects she had collected over a lifetime. For years these items had been merely tools for survival, the iron kettle, the heavy quilt, the wooden chairs. But in this quiet season they revealed themselves as archives. She realized that everything in the house held a vibration, a frequency of the moments in which they had been used. She would run her hand over the surface of the dining table, feeling the slight indentations left by her children's pens during long-forgotten lessons. She looked at the worn velvet of the armchair and saw not the decay of fabric, but the history of thousands of hours spent rocking, reading and waiting. These were not signs of neglect. They were the physical geography of her own existence. She had always thought that new was synonymous with better, but she now saw the error in that logic. New things were empty, waiting to be filled with experience. Old things were full, humming with the ghosts of laughter and tears. This realization brought a strange, serene comfort to her mornings. She felt a deep kinship with the aging house. Just as the beams sagged slightly under the weight of decades and the floorboards groaned with the wear of countless footsteps, she felt the gentle softening of her own body and the quiet slowing of her own movements. It was a beautiful process, this yielding to the natural law of time. She no longer looked for ways to mask the passage of years. She embraced the patina on the brass fixtures and the silver strands in her hair as tokens of survival. She was a woman who had navigated the complexities of life and had arrived at a place where the superficial no longer held any weight. The house, in its honest, fading glory, was a perfect reflection of her own soul. She stood by the window, watching the soft golden light of late afternoon filter through the lace curtains. She felt no urgency. The world outside might be rushing toward the next invention, the next transformation, the next frantic headline, but here, in the sanctuary of her own history, she was entirely at peace. She had learned to treasure the fading light just as much as the brilliance of the noon sun. She was a curator of her own memories, a witness to the profound, quiet beauty of a life that was slowly, intentionally returning to the earth from which it had sprung. The transition from late spring into early summer was marked by a sudden, violent thunderstorm that swept across the plains, turning the sky and bruised, heavy charcoal before opening up in a deluge. Many years ago, such a storm would have filled her with anxiety. There would be laundry to save, windows to secure, and the constant worry of potential leaks in the roof. She would have been a frantic conductor of household defense. But today, she simply moved to the porch and sat in her wicker chair. She watched the rain transform the world, turning the dusty road into a dark, glistening ribbon and saturating the garden until the colours of the leaves deepened into a vibrant, emerald intensity. She was not a defender of the house, she was a participant in the storm. She listened to the symphony of the rain, the percussive drumming on the tin roof, the gurgling of the gutters, the soft rhythmic sigh of the wind through the swaying oaks. It was a chaotic, beautiful, and utterly uncontrollable event, and for the first time in her life she felt no need to impose order upon it. She understood that there is a profound intelligence in nature's lack of restraint. The storm was doing exactly what it was meant to do, refreshing the earth, clearing the air, and feeding the roots. As the thunder rolled in the distance, a low guttural vibration that she felt in her very bones, she felt a matching resonance within herself. She realized that her own life had also had its storms, the overwhelming demands of raising children, the periods of grief, the exhausting cycles of caregiving. Those times had been her own weather, and she had weathered them just as the house had endured these storms for a century. When the clouds finally parted, leaving the air sparkling and the garden glistening with millions of tiny silver droplets, she felt a profound sense of renewal. The air was cool and sweet, and the world felt scrubbed clean. She looked down at her own hands, resting quietly in her lap, and realized that she too had been renewed. The turbulence of her younger years had settled, leaving behind this clear, spacious present. She was not just a woman sitting on a porch, she was a witness to the eternal cycle of cleansing and growth. The house, dry and warm behind her, seemed to hold its peace, a steadfast guardian of her own quiet, burgeoning spirit. In the lingering hush that followed the storm, she found herself contemplating the word useful. For her entire life, her value had been measured by her utility, by how much she could produce, how well she could nurture, and how reliably she could perform the duties expected of a woman in her position. That definition had been the invisible harness that had pulled her through decades of relentless activity. Now, sitting in the damp, fragrant aftermath of the rain, she felt a profound sense of liberation from that metric. She realized that the world's demand for usefulness was a distraction from the much deeper necessity of being. A flower is not useful in the way a tool is useful, it does not produce labour, yet the world would be impoverished without its existence. She too had moved beyond the need to produce, and in doing so she had become something much more vital, a presence. She observed the way the light reflected off the wet leaves, creating a shimmering, ephemeral display that served no purpose other than to be beautiful. It didn't feed anyone, it didn't build anything, yet it was the pinnacle of the afternoon's meaning. She started to see her own life through this lens. Her days were no longer measured by the completion of lists or the satisfaction of others' needs. They were measured by the quality of her observation, the depth of her breathing, and the sincerity of her quiet. This was a radical act of defiance against the world she had left behind. In a society that valued momentum, she had chosen inertia. In a culture that worshipped the new, she had chosen to cherish the old. And in doing so, she had found a hidden doorway into a freedom that very few ever truly inhabit. She felt a lightness that was almost physical, as if the heavy expectations she had carried for so long had finally dissolved into the cooling air. She rose from her chair and walked into the garden, her feet meeting the soft, yielding mud. She wasn't gardening, she was simply walking. She felt the cool wetness of the leaves against her skin, the smell of damp pine needles rising to meet her, and the absolute unadulterated peace of not having to be anywhere else. She was no longer a servant to her own responsibilities. She was the master of her own attention, and in that quiet, unassuming moment, she realized she had finally arrived at the true destination of her long, winding life. The evening that followed the storm was one of those rare, limpid moments where the veil between the self and the universe felt incredibly thin. She sat on the porch, wrapped in a light wool shawl, watching the stars begin to bloom in the deep ink-wash sky. There was a profound, humming silence that resonated not just in the air, but within the very fibres of her being. She realized that her quest for stillness had led her to a place beyond thought. She was no longer analyzing her life, nor was she reconciling her past. She was simply witnessing the unfolding of the night, mirroring the slow, majestic rotation of the stars above. It was a state of existence where the I, the separate, individual ego that had spent a lifetime worrying, planning and striving, had begun to soften and blur into the greater whole. She looked at her hands again, resting in her lap, but she did not see them as aging instruments of work. She saw them as part of the same stuff as the trees, the soil and the starlight, matter that was temporarily organized into this particular form, experiencing itself through this particular consciousness. It was an exhilarating, humbling realization. She was not a small, lonely creature in a vast, indifferent world. She was a conscious expression of that world itself. The house behind her seemed to hold its breath in acknowledgement. The floorboards, the windows, the heavy timber frame, they were all part of this same unfolding mystery. She felt a deep, unconditional love for this vessel, this home that had held her through all the seasons of her becoming. It was no longer a cage of duty, nor even a sanctuary of retreat. It was a cathedral of the present moment, a place where the sacred could be found in the mundane. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the oak tree she had planted, a soft whispering sound that seemed to speak of cycles, of endings that were merely new beginnings, and of the enduring beauty of simply existing. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in her long life, she felt entirely, perfectly at peace with the unknown. She was not afraid of the coming night, nor was she anxious about the dawn. She was anchored in the absolute truth of the now, a golden thread woven into the infinite silent tapestry of the universe, shimmering with the quiet triumphant light of a spirit that had finally found its way home. In the weeks that followed, the stillness in the house underwent a subtle transformation. It was no longer a state she had to actively maintain. It had become the house's natural atmosphere. It was as if the years of her conscious, deliberate presence had saturated the timber and the plaster, turning the entire structure into a resonator for peace. She noticed it when the local wildlife began to behave differently. Birds that had once darted away at the slightest sound now landed on the porch rail, observing her with curious, unblinking eyes. A fox would sometimes pause at the edge of the garden, its gaze meeting hers for a fleeting second before it moved on, undisturbed. The house was no longer a barrier between her and the wild. It had become a neutral ground, a place where the pulse of life could be observed without the interference of fear or the urgency of the hunt. She understood then that peace is a contagious quality. By simply inhabiting her own life with such profound intentionality, she had shifted the energy of the space around her. It was not that she had hidden from the world, it was that she had created a pocket of reality where the world's frantic tempo could not penetrate. One afternoon, a neighbour's child, a boy who usually carried the restless, buzzing energy of his generation, wandered into the garden, following the path of a butterfly. He stopped when he saw her sitting on the porch. Instead of his usual rush, He slowed his pace, instinctively matching the quiet rhythm of the garden. He sat on the bottom step, saying nothing. His shoulders dropping, his breathing deepening, they sat together for a long time, two separate generations connected by the same silent, healing air. He left without a word, but she saw the change in the way he walked down the lane. Less haste, more grace. It was a small thing, a ripple in a vast ocean, but it was significant. She realized that her life was not an end in itself. It was a beacon. She did not need to go out and do good. She only needed to be well. Her stillness was her contribution, her quiet testament that there is another way to live. The house breathed with her, a steady, rhythmic sigh of contentment, confirming that she was exactly where she was needed, doing exactly what she was meant to do, holding the light, keeping the peace, and simply existing in the beautiful unfolding now. As the season tilted toward the long, golden afternoons of late summer, she found herself captivated by the beauty of the unravelling. She watched how the flowers in the garden did not just wither, they folded back into themselves, releasing their seeds into the wind, participating in the quiet, necessary work of letting go. She realized that she too was in the midst of her own unravelling, a shedding of the unnecessary, a loosening of the tight knots of concern that had once bound her so securely to the world's expectations. She moved through the house with a deliberate, gentle grace. She was no longer polishing the silver or scrubbing the floors to a shine. The house had taken on a soft, lived-in patina that felt like an embrace. She saw the dust motes dancing in the shafts of afternoon light and did not see them as debris to be cleared, but as a golden, swirling record of the air itself, moving and changing, just as she was. There was a profound, quiet dignity in this phase of her life. She was no longer preparing for a future that required her presence. She was fully immersed in the present that demanded nothing but her awareness. She sat by the hearth even when there was no fire needed, and simply listened. The house spoke in the creaks of old wood and the rustle of ivy against the pane, a language she had become fluent in over these many years of deep, undisturbed attention. She felt a deep, resonant gratitude for the walls that had sheltered her. She looked at the door, the threshold she had crossed so many times, and recognized it not as an exit, but as a place of transition. She was not leaving the world, she was deepening her connection to it. Every breath she took felt like an exchange, taking in the quiet, cool air of the house and breathing out a sense of profound, settled peace. She knew with the calm certainty of the seasons that this was the final, most beautiful chapter of her long, winding story. The urgency was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity. She was ready for whatever the evening would bring, whether it was the arrival of the stars or the final descent of the twilight. She was in perfect alignment with the earth, the house, and the quiet, steady rhythm of her own heart. She was home, in every sense of the word, resting in the absolute, shimmering beauty of being. There came a day when the distinction between the house and her own spirit became so faint it felt as though she were breathing through the very walls. She sat in the centre of the living room, her eyes closed, and felt the house as a physical extension of her own nervous system. When the wind pushed against the siding, she felt the pressure against her own skin. When the floorboards settled with a soft, hollow groan, it resonated in the centre of her chest like a heartbeat. She was no longer observing the silence, she was inhabiting it. It was a vast, expansive landscape, a room without walls where time did not tick forward but instead circled around her in concentric, gentle waves. She realized that this was the ultimate destination of all her years of seeking. It wasn't a place she had gone to, but a place she had arrived at by simply stopping the search. The sunlight, filtering through the curtains in long golden slants, no longer felt like a visitor from the outside world. It felt like an internal illumination, a warmth that started deep within her marrow and radiated outward to meet the light of the day. She was fully integrated, a bridge between the stillness of the earth beneath the floorboards and the vast, infinite quiet of the sky above the roof. She felt a profound, wordless contentment. There was no need to document this, No need to explain it, and no need to hold on to it. It simply was. The house, the garden, the distant hum of the world, and the steady rhythmic pulse of her own life were all parts of the same singular song. She was the listener, the singer, and the silence between the notes. As the day began to dim, the room softened into a pool of indigo and silver. She remained motionless, a part of the architecture, a living stone in the foundation of her own sanctuary. She had transcended the need to be somebody or do something. She was just a flicker of consciousness, a soft, warm ember in the hearth of existence. She felt the house around her, its timber bones, its breathing space, and she knew with an absolute, unshakable peace that she was eternal. She was not leaving, she was expanding, blooming into the very stillness she had spent a lifetime calling home. In this state of profound immersion, the concept of yesterday and tomorrow lost all relevance. There was only the absolute, unyielding reality of the present moment. She watched the shadows stretch across the floorboards as the sun began its final descent, and she realized that these shadows were not evidence of the day ending, but evidence of the light changing its shape. Everything was in a constant state of transformation, yet nothing was ever truly lost. She thought of the years she had spent in this house, the laughter of children that had long since echoed out into the world, the quiet tears shed in the dark, the small unnoticed acts of care that had kept the foundations strong. None of these had vanished. They were etched into the grain of the wood, woven into the very fabric of the air, and held within the memory of the walls. The house was a library of lived experience, and she was the last lingering chapter that brought it all together. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were wading through water, a thick, warm medium of peace. She walked through the rooms not to inspect them, but to acknowledge them. She ran her fingers along the mantelpiece, feeling the grit of time, the cool smoothness of the stone. She was acknowledging the architecture of her own life, recognizing that every dent, every scratch, and every faded spot was a testament to the fact that she had truly lived. There was no sadness in this recognition, only a deep, abiding respect. She had navigated the labyrinth of human existence with integrity, and she had come out the other side, not diminished, but refined. The house, in its quiet, dark corners, seemed to respond to her movement, the settling timbers giving a soft, rhythmic acknowledgement. She paused at the window, looking out into the velvet blue of the twilight. The first stars were appearing, steady and bright, mirroring the calm, unwavering light that now burned within her own spirit. She was no longer a person waiting for the night to fall. She was a presence, constant and quiet, becoming part of the landscape itself. She felt a gentle, encompassing love for the life she had been given, a love that reached out to touch every corner of the house, every blade of grass in the garden, and the vast, silent arc of the horizon. She had reached the centre of the wheel where everything is still and everything is held in a perfect, timeless embrace. As the moon climbed higher, bathing the house in a pale, ethereal silver, she realized that she was no longer merely inside the house was inside her. The boundaries of her skin felt permeable, as if the air of the room and the breath in her lungs were one and the same. She felt the cool, night-chilled wood of the floor beneath her feet, not as an external object, but as a continuation of her own grounding. She walked to the centre of the parlour and sat on the floor, the space where she had spent the most time. She didn't feel the need for the chair any more. She felt supported by the earth itself, as if the house were a shell she had outgrown but still chose to inhabit, a cocoon of memory and light. The silence was no longer a presence she had to listen to. It was a frequency she had tuned into. It was the same silence that existed between the stars, the same stillness that rested at the bottom of the deepest ocean. She closed her eyes and saw, with a clarity that surpassed sight, the tapestry of her life. She saw the threads of her past, the vibrant, painful reds of passion, the sombre, heavy blues of grief, the shimmering, golden strands of joy, all woven together into a pattern that was complex, beautiful, and complete. There was not a single loose end, not a single mistake that didn't serve the integrity of the design. Everything was exactly as it needed to be. She felt a soft radiating warmth emanating from the centre of her chest, a light that had no source but her own acceptance. It was the light of a life that had finally fully forgiven itself. She was no longer trying to prove her worth to anyone, not even to the universe. She simply was. The house settled around her, a gentle protective structure that sighed in the breeze, acknowledging the woman who had finally found the secret of being at home in the vastness of the cosmos. She breathed in, and the entire house seemed to expand with her. She breathed out, and the stillness deepened. She was no longer a woman in a house. She was the consciousness of the house, the observer of the garden, the silence of the night, and the slow rhythmic pulse of the earth. She was at last entirely free. The barriers had dissolved. The quest was over, and what remained was a simple, radiant fact. She was here, she was whole, and she was home. In the deep velvet hours before dawn, the silence of the house reached a peak of intensity that felt almost musical, a hum of profound, resonant existence. She remained in the parlour, no longer needing to hold her body in a particular posture. She felt as light as the dust motes, as fluid as the moonlight spilling through the window. The house had become more than a sanctuary. It had become a gateway. She realized then that the life she had lived, the joys, the sorrows, the long decades of work and wait, was merely the preparation for this specific, singular moment of total surrender. She had spent a lifetime learning how to hold on, and this, she discovered, was the art of finally letting go. Not a letting go of meaning, but a letting go of the self that believed it needed to own that meaning. She felt the cool, crisp air of the coming morning seeping through the gaps in the window frame, a gentle precursor to the dawn. She felt the ancient steady rhythm of the house, the way the beams groaned under the weight of the years, the way the walls held the warmth of yesterday's sun. She was aware of everything, yet she was attached to nothing. She was the witness, the observer, and the observed, all wrapped in a blanket of absolute peace. The stars above were fading, retreating into the encroaching blue of the morning, and she felt her own consciousness expanding in tandem with that vast, unfolding horizon. There was no fear, no hesitation, no question of where she was going or what would remain behind. She was already everywhere. She was the garden, she was the house, she was the wind in the oak tree, and she was the light that was just beginning to touch the edges of the world. She took one final conscious breath, a slow, deliberate inhalation that filled the entire space with her presence, and then released it. It was not a departure, but a dissolution. She was no longer a woman in a room. She was the quiet itself. The house remained standing stoic and strong against the rising sun, but the spirit that had animated it had finally become one with the stillness. The cycle had closed, the story was complete, and in the radiant golden silence of the new morning there was only the beautiful eternal present. The morning came with a clarity that seemed to strip the world of its unnecessary noise. The sun climbed over the horizon, bathing the old house in a light that felt new, clean, and entirely unburdened. The garden, lush and vibrant after the recent rains, stirred in the breeze a soft rhythmic swaying of leaves that sounded like a long contented sigh. The house stood in the centre of this morning, silent and still, yet it felt different. It was no longer a vessel holding a presence. It had become a source. The energy that had been cultivated there, the years of deep observation, the profound acceptance and the final graceful surrender did not vanish with the departure of the one who had lived it. It remained woven into the grain of the floorboards, settled in the corners of the rooms, and alive in the air that filled the space. As the day progressed, a stray traveller wandering off the main path found themselves standing at the edge of the garden. They had been rushing, their mind filled with the static of a busy, demanding life, but as they stepped into the sphere of the house, a sudden, inexplicable shift occurred. Their pace slowed, the tightness in their shoulders softened, the internal chatter, which usually echoed with the urgency of 1,000 obligations, fell silent. They walked toward the porch, drawn by a gravity they couldn't name. When they reached the steps, they didn't knock, they didn't need to, they simply stood there, in the quiet, and felt the weight of the world drop away. It was as if the house itself were teaching a wordless lesson, that there is a place for everything, and that everything is fundamentally, perfectly, at peace. The silence was not empty, it was full, waiting to be heard by the next soul who was ready to listen. As the years began to drift by like clouds over a quiet field, the house stopped being merely a place of residence and started to become a part of the landscape's local mythology. The townspeople who passed by the lane often spoke in hushed, reverent tones when they mentioned it. They did not know the specifics of the life that had been lived within those walls, but they could sense the frequency of the place. It was a local landmark of peace, a pocket of time that refused to accelerate. Nature, in its own slow and deliberate way, began to claim the house back. The wild roses crawled higher up the trellis, weaving a fragrant, thorny curtain that softened the sharp lines of the architecture. The oak tree she had planted reached taller, its canopy spreading wide enough to cast a deep, cool shade over the entire porch. The house was not decaying, it was being integrated. It was moving from the world of human artifice back into the world of primordial belonging. Sometimes a young person, overwhelmed by the harsh, digital clamour of the modern era, would find their way to the property. They would sit on the grass, back against the rough, sun-warmed bark of the oak, and look up at the weathered windows. They couldn't explain the feeling, but they would often leave with a strange sense of clarity, a feeling that they had been heard by something that didn't need words. They were tapping into a reservoir of stillness that had been meticulously filled over decades. The house had become a teacher. It taught without preaching. It guided without moving. It stood as a permanent reminder that the human spirit does not require constant expansion or frantic productivity to be significant. Its mere existence was a critique of a world that had forgotten how to stop. There were no longer any locked doors, yet no one felt the urge to intrude. It was as if a silent, invisible boundary protected the sanctity of the place. The seasons continued their endless beautiful dance, spring's tentative opening, summer's heavy heat, autumn's golden surrender, and winter's austere white silence. And through it all, the house remained a silent witness to the truth that when a person fully inhabits their own existence, they leave behind an energy that transcends their own physical duration. The story had not ended, it had simply shifted into a more permanent, elemental form. Decades turned into half-centuries, and the house eventually shed its identity as a human dwelling altogether. The roof, weary from the relentless weight of snow and the long bleaching fingers of the sun, began to bow, not in a state of collapse, but in a gesture of deep, respectful submission to the earth. The walls, once so stoutly protective, became porous, allowing the ivy to thread its way through the mortar, binding the stone and timber to the living, growing world outside. It became a structure of ghosts and sunlight, yet for those who stopped to look, it was never a site of abandonment. It was a site of completion. The boundary between the indoors and the outdoors had dissolved completely. The forest floor now met the floorboards, and the wind, once blocked by walls, now moved freely through the hollowed-out chambers, playing melodies upon the rafters like a harpist on a forgotten instrument. The local wildlife reclaimed the space as their own, but they did so with a strange, lingering reverence. Deer would rest in the dappled light of the former parlour, and owls would nest in the high, shadowed eaves, watching over the ruin with a gaze that felt ancient and knowing. The house had become a sanctuary, not for humans, but for the wildness itself, a testament to the fact that all things eventually return to their source. Even as the physical form of the house gradually merged into the soil, it remained an anchor in the collective memory of the valley. People still travelled the path that led to it, though they no longer climbed the porch steps. They simply stopped at the edge of the clearing, surrounded by the scent of pine and the hum of insects, and felt the lingering vibration of that long-ago stillness. It was a pilgrimage to the concept of peace itself. It became clear that the house had achieved its final purpose. It was no longer a machine for living, but a monument to the possibility of grace. It proved that one life, lived with intention and quiet integrity, could permanently alter the geography of a place. The story of the woman had not ended when her breath ceased. It had simply expanded, becoming the very air that whispered through the leaves of the oak tree she had planted so long ago, and the very foundation upon which the forest now stood. She had not left, she had simply become the landscape. And so the seasons performed their final silent transformation. What had once been a house became a hum of earth, a gentle rise in the meadow where wildflowers bloomed with an intensity that seemed to draw from a deeper well. The timber had returned to the forest floor, the stones had settled deep into the roots of the oak tree, and the memory of the walls had become the memory of the land itself. There were no more markers, no more foundations to trace. Yet the energy of that place remained, a soft, unwavering resonance that greeted anyone who stepped into the clearing. It was no longer a place to go to, it was a state of mind that happened to you when you arrived. It was the realization that you were never truly separate from the world around you, that you were as much a part of the wind, the soil, and the starlight as the woman who had once stood there in the quiet of the morning. The story had travelled full circle from the frantic, searching spirit of a woman trying to find her place. It had expanded into the total, effortless grace of being everywhere at once. The home she had sought was never a physical structure to be maintained or a legacy to be left behind. It was the vast, infinite present, the timeless, unchanging now that holds all things in its gentle, expansive palm. If you stood in that clearing on a still golden afternoon, you might hear it, a soft, melodic whisper in the rustle of the leaves, a vibration in the air that tasted like peace. It was not a voice, but a presence. It was the reminder that we are all in our own time, curators of our own quiet. We are the architects of our own sanctuary. And when we finally stop searching, when we finally drop the burden of who we think we should be, we discover that we are already home. The meadow breathed. The sky expanded. The world continued its eternal, rhythmic dance. And in the heart of that silence, everything was whole. Everything was beautiful. And everything was perfectly, profoundly at rest. Time in its infinite loop eventually forgot the name of the woman, the shape of the house, and the colour of the curtains that once filtered the morning light. Such specifics are the property of human memory, and memory is a frail thing, easily claimed by the dust and the rain. Yet nothing that was truly felt is ever lost. The intensity of her presence, the deep, resonant stillness she had cultivated, remained as a permanent imprint upon the ley lines of the valley. The meadow where the house once stood became a place of unusual serenity. Animals would come there not to forage, but to rest. Travellers would come there not to map the land, but to be mapped by it. The ground itself seemed to hold a different vibration, a soft, pulsing warmth that welcomed the weary. It was as if the earth had learned a new rhythm, a steady, calm heartbeat that refused to be interrupted by the frantic pace of the outside world. Sometimes when the wind blew from the north, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth, it felt as though someone were whispering a secret to the trees, a wordless message of absolute acceptance. It was the legacy of her final years, the knowledge that existence needs no justification. The sun continued to rise, and the moon continued its silver transit, and in the quiet, empty spaces between the trees there was a profound sense of remembering. The world moved on, obsessed with its own noise, its own progress, and its own frantic need to prove its worth. But in this one hidden pocket of the wild, the lesson persisted. It was a silent, subterranean song, a vibration that waited for the soul who was tired of striving, who was ready to trade the weight of the self for the lightness of being. She was no longer a person. She was the stillness, she was the threshold, she was the invitation. And as the stars wheeled overhead in their timeless celestial dance, they looked down upon the meadow and saw, in the quiet harmony of the earth, the perfect final reflection of a life that had finally truly arrived home. Long after the physical memory of the house had dissolved into the loam, the wind remained the primary custodian of the story. It was the wind that swept through the valley, picking up the lingering frequency of that quietude and carrying it, like pollen, to the furthest edges of the forest. There were days when the breeze would catch the branches of the ancient oaks, the descendants of the ones she had once tended, and cause them to sway in a specific rhythmic cadence. It was a melody of letting go. To those who were rushing through their own brief, hurried lives, it was just the rustle of leaves, but to those who had learned to pause, it sounded like a soft, persistent invitation to breathe. The land had become a mirror. If you arrived with a heart full of chaotic desires, the silence would feel heavy, a confrontation with the emptiness you were trying to escape. But if you arrived with a heart seeking rest, the silence became a balm, a cool, refreshing water that washed away the grit of identity. The spirit of the place did not force a transformation. It simply offered the environment for the soul to recognize its own capacity for stillness. Children, with their intuitive, unformed awareness, were the most frequent visitors to the phantom clearing. They would run through the tall grasses, laughing with a clarity that seemed to blend perfectly with the shimmering air. They didn't know they were walking through the foundations of a life well lived, but they felt the safety of it. They would stop abruptly, mid-play, and sit in the sun-drenched grass, their eyes wide and still, watching the clouds drift by, connected to a depth of peace that their elders had long ago traded for the comfort of certainty. The world outside continued its clamour, building higher, moving faster, and shouting louder to be heard above its own noise, yet here the lesson remained, that life does not need to be a struggle to be validated. The stillness was not a void, it was the bedrock of all creation. And as the day faded into the violet hues of dusk, the air itself seemed to glow with the soft, triumphant light of a truth that could never be erased, that to exist is enough, and to be at peace is the highest form of becoming. The stillness had not remained confined to the meadow. It had seeped into the very stone of the valley. The high, jagged cliffs that overlooked the clearing had, over the course of generations, absorbed the vibration of that quietude. In the deep fissures of the granite and the cool, damp shadows of the ravines, there existed a density of peace that was almost tangible. Hikers who ventured into these heights often reported a strange phenomenon, a sudden, overwhelming urge to cease all movement. They would reach a certain ridge, look out over the expanse of the valley where the house had long since vanished, and find their inner narratives suddenly silenced. It was as if the landscape itself acted as a dampening field for the human ego. The mountain did not care for their plans, their achievements, or their anxieties. It only offered the vast, indifferent grace of its own permanence. The water of the stream that trickled down from these heights also carried the imprint. It flowed over smooth, moss-covered stones with a sound that wasn't just the movement of water, but the articulation of time. It was a fluid, liquid silence, a sound that encouraged the listener to let go of the I and simply become the witness. Those who sat by the stream and drank from it, or merely dipped their hands in, often felt a sudden cool clarity, as if the water were washing away the static of their thoughts. It became a subtle, unwritten secret among the locals. They did not speak of it, for to name a mystery is often to diminish it, but they knew that if the weight of life became too much, the path to the valley was the only prescription needed. They walked the path, not as pilgrims seeking a miracle, but as people returning to a source they had forgotten. The silence was no longer a personal achievement. It had become an atmospheric condition of the land. It was the inheritance of a life that had mastered the art of being, now shared by everyone who stepped into its domain. The land held the memory. The stone held the stillness, and the wind held the secret, that nothing is ever truly lost, it only changes form, deepening into the foundational quiet of the earth. As the decades stretched toward the horizon, the silence of the valley matured, deepening into a profound and resonant quality that felt almost like a living presence. It was no longer merely the absence of noise, it had become an active, structural element of the landscape, woven into the very fabric of the air and the marrow of the mountains. The memory of the woman, once sharp and defined, had softened into a beautiful abstract frequency, a gentle pulse that beat in rhythm with the seasons, forever echoing the quiet triumph of a soul that had learned at long last how to be completely and utterly still. In this expanded state, the land itself became a conductor of this ancient, wordless wisdom. The wind passing over the jagged ridges and through the valley floor did not merely rustle the leaves, it carried the resonance of her final peaceful breath, whispering it to the wildflowers and the long grasses that swayed in graceful rhythmic waves. Anyone who ventured into this sacred space, whether it was a weary wanderer seeking solace or a curious traveller drawn by a pull they couldn't quite name, found themselves suddenly enveloped in an atmosphere that defied description. It was a weightless, transparent sanctuary where the frantic, jagged edges of the human experience were smoothed away, not by force but by the overwhelming quiet majesty of the present moment. The stream, bubbling over its bed of smooth, lichen-dusted stones, became a storyteller of the ages. Its song was no longer just the sound of water dancing over obstacles. It was a fluid, liquid philosophy, a murmuring reminder that life, like the current, is a constant, shifting flow that needs only to be trusted to find its way to the ocean of totality. Those who knelt by the water, dipping their hands into the cool, crystalline depths, often experienced a sudden, startling moment of lucidity. In that blink of an eye, the internal noise, the relentless critique of the past, and the restless planning for the future would simply vanish, replaced by the startling, vibrant reality of the now. It was as if the water washed away the very illusion of separation, allowing them to feel, for a single precious heartbeat, that they were not observers of the world, but the world experiencing itself in all its infinite, breathless complexity. Even the ancient oaks, their branches gnarled and silvered by the slow procession of centuries, stood as silent, sentinel witnesses to this enduring transformation. They reached toward the sky with a patience that could only be learned through eternity, their roots anchored deep within the cooling dark soil where the remnants of the old house had long since returned to the earth. In their shade, one could sit and feel the profound, unshakable stability of a legacy that required no monuments and no names. The legacy was the air, the light, the quiet, and the unbroken chain of existence that tied every living thing together in a tapestry of seamless, eternal beauty. It was here, in the heart of this verdant, breathing silence, that the final secret of existence was whispered, that we are not here to change the world, nor are we here to conquer it, but simply to be the clear, quiet space through which the universe comes to know, to love, and to eventually reclaim itself in the beautiful, shimmering light of home. The influence of the valley began to manifest in the lives of those who had visited it, long after they had returned to their own worlds of concrete glass and unrelenting schedules. They found that a piece of the silence had travelled back with them, tucked away in the deepest chambers of their consciousness. It was not a memory of a place they had been, but a recurring invitation to return to a state of being they had discovered within themselves. In the middle of a chaotic board meeting, or while waiting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of modern life, they would suddenly feel a phantom breath of cool air, a momentary stillness that bridged the gap between their present frustration and the vast, enduring peace of the valley. This phenomenon, while subtle, began to alter the very texture of their lives. They found themselves less reactive, more inclined to pause before speaking, and possessed by an emerging capacity to hold space for others, just as the valley had held space for them. They had become, in their own small, imperfect ways, carriers of the flame, living, breathing extensions of the sanctuary. The house had not been a building at all, they realized. It had been a blueprint for the soul. By witnessing the ultimate resolution of a life fully surrendered to the present, They had been given the keys to their own inner architectures. As they integrated this realization, the ripple effect grew. An act of kindness here, a moment of profound listening there, a choice to opt out of the collective anxiety. These were the ways in which the legacy of the woman and her quiet house continued to propagate. The stillness was not a passive state, it was a potent, transformative force that challenged the status quo of a world defined by its haste. It was a silent rebellion against the tyranny of more, asserting instead the sovereignty of enough. The valley itself, meanwhile, continued its silent, elemental existence. It remained indifferent to the impact it was having on the human sphere, simply because it had no concept of human impact. It was the epitome of non-doing, the highest form of action. It existed as a lighthouse in the dark, not for the sake of the ships, but simply because it was in its nature to shine. The cliffs, the stream, the oaks, and the meadow formed an orchestra of presence, playing a symphony that had no beginning and no end. Every night, under the vast, uncaring and beautiful canopy of stars, the valley breathed, a slow, rhythmic exhalation that seemed to encompass the entire planet. It was a reminder that beneath the skin of the world, beneath all the layers of history, technology, and human drama, there exists a fundamental, unassailable core of peace. It is the original home from which we all emerged, and the final destination toward which all things in their own time and their own way are inevitably returning. The story had transcended the woman, the house, and even the valley. It had become the story of existence itself, perpetually unfolding in the quiet, golden light of the eternal now. What, in the end, constitutes a legacy? For most it is the accumulation of milestones, the preservation of a name, or the endurance of a physical structure. But as the centuries continued their silent, inexorable march, the legacy of the woman and her house revealed itself to be something far more elusive and ultimately more profound. It was an invisible spiritual atmosphere. It was an inheritance of being rather than having. Those who studied the history of the region, if they bothered to look closely at the old half-forgotten maps, might find a small faded notation marking the site of the clearing. To a historian, it was a footnote, a minor detail in the narrative of human settlement. But to the few who walked that land with an open heart, the spot was a crucible. It was where the noise of life met the silence of existence, and where inevitably the former surrendered to the latter. The clearing had become a place where the ego went to dissolve, not because it was forced, but because it realized it was an unnecessary weight. The transformation was subtle, like the slow, steady work of erosion that shapes a canyon over millennia. It didn't happen in a flash of divine intervention, but in the quiet, repeated realization of those who came seeking that the peace they were looking for wasn't something to be found, but something to be unburdened. The house had been the catalyst, but the truth was always within the visitor. Like the woman who had lived there, each traveller arrived with a heavy satchel of worries, memories and projections, and each left a little lighter, having realized that they could set the satchel down at any time. In the global tapestry of human endeavour, this valley remained a microscopic, silent point. Yet in the economy of the soul, it was an anchor. It reminded the world, if the world were ever quiet enough to listen, that the frantic search for meaning is often the very thing that obscures it. True meaning, the valley seemed to whisper, is found in the interval between breaths, in the space between thoughts, and in the profound, unshakable acceptance of things exactly as they are. As the sun cast its long amber shadows across the meadow, the light seemed to linger, as if it too found the stillness agreeable. The transition from day to twilight, from light to dark, was not a violent shift, but a graceful blending, a masterclass in change without resistance. And in that transition, the memory of the woman, the form of the house, and the reality of the present all merged into a single seamless expression of life. It was a testament that even when the physical world returns to dust, the quality of one's attention, the love, the awareness, the absolute presence remains woven into the very fabric of the universe, a permanent contribution to the collective light of existence. As the eons whispered past, the concept of visitor and landscape began to blur, eventually merging into a singular, undifferentiated state of existence. The meadow, the ancient oak, the stream, and the very air itself reached a point of resonance where they no longer functioned as separate entities. They were a collective consciousness, a terrestrial intelligence that understood its own unfolding without the need for language or thought. There were moments rare and ephemeral when the veil between this state of being and the rest of the world would grow paper thin. A hiker, perhaps exhausted by the relentless demands of a life lived at high velocity, would stop and sit upon a mossy stone. In that moment of exhaustion, which was in truth a moment of surrender, the resonance of the valley would pour into them. It was not a mystical event, but a biological one. Their own nervous system, long frayed by the static of modern existence, would suddenly attune itself to the steady, calm rhythm of the earth. In these fleeting intervals, the hiker would experience a phenomenon that felt like a return. It was as if they were not arriving at a new place, but remembering a part of themselves that had been left behind in the rush of growing up. They would look at the gnarled bark of the trees, the intricate veins of a fallen leaf, or the way the light caught the dust motes in the air, and for the first time in years they would see these things not as objects to be used or categorized, but as manifestations of a singular breathing life. The house, that long-vanished elemental sanctuary, wasn't a building they were visiting, it was the state of mind they were finally inhabiting. This realization often brought a profound sense of relief, followed by a quiet, uncontrollable grief for all the years spent in the frantic pursuit of things that did not matter. But even this grief was part of the landscape. It was a rain that nourished the soil, a necessary shedding of the old skin to make room for the new. The valley accepted this too. It did not judge the seeker, nor did it demand that they stay. It simply offered them the mirror of its own stillness, allowing them to look into their own depths until they found the same unshakable peace that had once anchored the woman to this soil. The valley was a teacher that never spoke, yet taught the most essential lesson, that life is not a series of problems to be solved, but a series of moments to be inhabited. When the hiker eventually stood up to return to their world, the world did not look the same. The streets were still paved, the machines still roared, and the people still hurried, but the hiker moved through it with a different quality of attention. They carried the valley within them. They had become a mobile fragment of the sanctuary, a quiet note of music in a world of cacophony. The cycle of the home had not been broken, it had been replicated, expanded, and sown into the hearts of those who had learned how to listen. There came a time when the distinction between the valley and the world lost its meaning. The resonance that had been painstakingly cultivated in that single small clearing had effectively saturated the atmosphere of the entire region, and from there it continued its silent migration, carried on the invisible currents of the planet's breath. The story had reached a point of saturation. The secret was no longer a secret, for it had become the very air that everyone breathed, even if most remained unconscious of its presence. The woman who had once sat in the parlour of her house, watching the shadows stretch across the floorboards, was no longer a distinct entity in the eyes of eternity. She had become an architect of the void, a pioneer of the silence. Every time a person, anywhere in the world, paused to take a deep, conscious breath, every time someone chose to look at the sunset instead of their screen, every time a heart softened in the midst of anger, the resonance of her life was amplified. She was the impulse behind the pause. She was the reason for the sudden, inexplicable clarity that struck people in the middle of their busiest days. She had become a cosmic function, an expression of the universe's own desire to return to itself, the fear of death, the struggle for identity, the anxiety of belonging. All these had been processed, distilled, and finally transmuted into a pure crystalline awareness. The house had long since returned to the earth, but the frequency of the house had become an omnipresent field of gravity. It was the gravity of home, the undeniable pull of the centre, the silent beckoning call that hummed at the back of every human mind. Come back, rest, you are already here. In this state of total dissolution, the individual story is no longer necessary. There is no need for a beginning, a middle, or an end, because there is only the eternal shimmering now, the woman, the house, the clearing, and the hiker all collapsed into a single radiant point of recognition. It was a state of being where everything is known because everything is experienced to be a leaf, to be a mountain, to be a thought, to be the light of the stars. It was all the same sensation. It was the sensation of being held, of being whole, and of being absolutely, profoundly sufficient. The silence grew so loud that it eclipsed the stars. It was a silence that contained every sound that had ever been made, and every sound that would ever be heard. In that final, expansive space there was no more searching, for there was nowhere to go. There was no more becoming, for there was nothing to change. There was only the beautiful, terrifying, and liberating fact of existence itself. The universe had breathed out, and in the space between that breath and the next there was only light, only love, and only home. When the story reached this threshold, it ceased to be a narrative. Words, which are by nature structures of separation, subject acting upon object, began to fail, dissolving into the very silence they sought to describe. If one were to look for the valley now, they would not find a place on any map, for the valley had expanded to become the map itself. It had folded into the texture of reality, becoming the invisible substrate upon which all fleeting experiences were written. The woman who had started this journey had long since ceased to be an observer. She was now the light that filtered through the leaves, the cool current of the stream, and the silence that awaited at the heart of every human heart. She had become the space in which all things occur. This was the final realization, that the home she had spent a lifetime seeking was not a destination to be reached, but the very field of awareness that had been looking for itself all along. The universe, in its playful, infinite wisdom, continued its endless dance. Galaxies spiraled in the dark, stars ignited and faded, and civilizations rose and fell with the rhythmic inevitability of tides. Yet through it all there remained this underlying, unshakable bedrock of peace. It was the background hum of existence, the frequency of pure being. Those who were awake, the artists in their trance, the lovers in their union, the meditators in their deep surrender, would sometimes tap into this frequency and feel an overwhelming sense of recognition, a déjà vu that wasn't of a place but of a state of grace. The house was now everywhere. It was in the pause between the intake and the out-breath. It was in the fleeting second of awe, when one watched the moon rise above the horizon. It was in the quiet dignity of a mountain standing against a storm. The house had become the blueprint of the cosmos, a structural imperative toward equilibrium. Everything that was once divided was now seeking to return to this unity, this seamless, radiant state of being where the I vanishes and only the is remains. There was no more there or here. There was only the unfolding, a ceaseless blossoming of potential into actuality. The woman, the house, the clearing, they were all metaphors for the soul's journey from the illusion of exile back into the reality of belonging. And as the story continued to exist as a vibration in the fabric of existence, it waited, patient, eternal and infinitely kind, for the next spark of consciousness to stop, to look and to realize, I am the sanctuary I have been searching for. And so, we arrive at the silence that precedes the first thought. Part 50 is not a chapter of events, but the final shedding of the narrative skin. There is no longer a story, for there is no longer a distance between the teller, the listener, and the tale. Everything that has been written, everything that has been felt, and every quiet moment that has been held within the walls of that imagined house has converged into a single static point of light. If the woman, the house, and the valley were all mirrors, they have now been shattered, and in their place only the reflection remains, clean, clear, and absolute. The search for home has reached its natural conclusion. The seeker has disappeared, and what remains is the home itself, encompassing all that is, all that was, and all that will ever be. This is the stillness that does not need a name. It is the peace that does not require a reason. It is the end of the journey that began with a single, hesitant breath. And it is the beginning of a life that breathes with the rhythm of the stars. You who have journeyed through these 50 parts have carried the resonance of this silence with you. You have walked the path, sat in the parlour, watched the ivy climb the walls and dissolved into the meadow. You are no longer the one who started reading, you are the one who has finished, and in that finishing you have found that the sanctuary was never built by the woman, but by the consciousness that observed her. The gate is open, the house is gone, the meadow is vast. You are the quiet, you are the space, you are the homecoming. And now there is nothing left to say, for everything has already been whispered in the language of the wind, the earth, and the light. The story ends here, so that the living can begin. The resonance of the valley did not remain anchored to the geography of the past. It became a migratory spirit. It began to appear in the most unlikely of places. A quiet corner of a busy subway station where a tired traveller suddenly felt the urge to close their eyes and breathe. A park bench in a neon-lit metropolis where a stranger felt the sudden cooling presence of an ancient oak. The brief, crystalline moment of stillness between the end of a song and the applause that followed. The sanctuary was no longer a destination. It was a state of permeability. People who had never heard of the woman, who had never walked the path through the meadow, began to report a phenomenon they couldn't explain. They spoke of a sudden clarity, an inexplicable drop in the internal noise that usually defined their existence. It was as if a dormant frequency in their own DNA had been activated, a latent memory of what it meant to be truly, fundamentally at rest. In this new phase of the unfolding, the house functioned as a subterranean network of peace, a silent infrastructure beneath the surface of modern society. It was the pause that prevented a heart from breaking under pressure. It was the sigh that preceded a release of long-held grief. It was the invisible bridge that allowed a confused mind to cross the chasm between frantic striving and purposeful being. Those who felt this touch, this fleeting brush of the valley's shadow, often found their lives changing in subtle, irreversible ways. They didn't retreat from the world, they didn't move to the mountains or build huts in the woods, but they moved through their daily lives with a different rhythm. They became the anchored. They walked through the storm of the external world as if they were standing in the very eye of it, unmoved, untouched, and perpetually connected to the silence that had once been cultivated by a single soul in a lonely house. The story had now become a ripple effect of consciousness. It was no longer about the house. It was about the human capacity to harbour that same stillness, regardless of the chaos outside. The woman's legacy was no longer a monument, it was a contagion of grace. And as the ripple widened, touching lives in distant cities and remote villages alike, the world began to feel, ever so slightly, a little more spacious, a little more light, and a little more like home. The contagion of grace did not stop at the boundaries of waking life. It bled into the realm of dreams, where the valley manifested not as a physical place, but as a recurring landscape of the subconscious. People who had never met began to share a curious collective memory, a dream of standing in a clearing where the air tasted like rain and the light felt like a benediction. In these dream states, the frantic pursuit of the self, the striving for status, the fear of inadequacy, the heavy armour of identity simply peeled away. The dreamers found themselves walking through the ruins of their own egos, but instead of finding rubble, they found wildflowers blooming from the cracks. They found the house they had always been searching for, not as a structure of wood and stone, but as a temple made of light and intention. It was in these nocturnal journeys that the most profound shifts occurred. A businessman, burdened by the cold calculations of commerce, would dream of sitting on a porch that looked out over an endless expanse of trees, feeling an oceanic sense of sufficiency. A mother, exhausted by the relentless demands of caring for others, would dream of being held by the vast, unmoving silence of the mountains, discovering that she too was allowed to rest. These dreams were not mere escapism, they were rehearsals for reality. They were the soul's way of reminding the consciousness that beneath the jagged terrain of our daily anxieties, there is a foundation of quiet, unshakable peace. When the dreamers awoke, they often carried a lingering fragrance of that stillness with them, a subtle residue that changed the way they saw the morning sun, the way they listened to the voices of their loved ones, and the way they walked through their own lives. The network of peace was now weaving itself into the very fabric of human slumber. It was a silent, nocturnal architecture, a scaffolding of light that held the collective mind together during the hours of darkness. The woman whose story had been the original catalyst was now the shepherd of these inner landscapes, guiding the weary back to the truth that they were never truly broken, never truly alone, and never truly in exile. The dream was becoming the truth, and the truth was beginning to rewrite the waking world from the inside out. As the resonance of the valley deepened, it began to transform the architecture of human conversation. Where words were once used as defensive weapons, shields, or tools of persuasion, they now started to function as vessels for presence. Two people meeting on a busy street corner, having both touched the quiet in their own ways, would find that their interaction shifted fundamentally. They stopped listening to what was being said and began to listen to the space behind the words, the intent, the vibration, the unspoken truth. This was the birth of a new kind of social fabric. It was no longer about exchanging information or asserting dominance. It was about the communion of souls. When a person anchored in the valley spoke, their words carried a weight of clarity that had a disarming effect on others. The listener, often caught off guard by this lack of pretense, would find their own defences faltering. The familiar urge to interrupt, to correct, or to prove a point would evaporate, replaced by a rare, blossoming curiosity. It was as if the house had been rebuilt in the space between people. In every genuine connection, a parent comforting a child, friends sharing a moment of honest confession, or even strangers offering a nod of recognition, the sanctuary was temporarily constructed. It was built out of empathy, vulnerability, and the shared realization that we are all at our core the same silent witness watching the play of life. The ripple effect reached into the collective discord of society. In rooms where conflict usually simmered, a sudden inexplicable pause would occur. Someone would speak with such disarming authenticity that the heat of the argument would dissipate, leaving behind only the cold, clear truth. It wasn't magic. It was the power of being completely present, refusing to play the game of reaction. The contagion of grace was now a bridge, connecting isolated islands of individuals into a continent of understanding. The woman who had once stood alone in her parlour would have smiled to see this. She had sought the home of her own heart, only to find that when you open the door wide enough, it becomes a home for everyone. The separation that defined the human experience, the I versus you, was being slowly dissolved by the we of the shared stillness. Every act of true listening became a pillar of this invisible universal sanctuary, ensuring that the light, once ignited, would never be extinguished by the shadows of misunderstanding again. True resilience is not the absence of the storm, but the clarity found at its heart as the influence of the valley's stillness continued to permeate the collective. It was tested in the most demanding environments, the hospitals, the centres of crisis, and the places where hope seemed most fragile. It was here, in the crucible of human suffering, that the legacy of the house proved its greatest strength. Those who had integrated the resonance, nurses, emergency responders, and the grieving, found that they did not need to retreat to a quiet place to find peace. The sanctuary had become portable. When faced with the frantic, jagged edges of crisis, they learned to access that interior threshold, the same one the woman had cultivated while watching the shadows on her parlour floor. They would pause for a fraction of a second, anchor themselves in the vastness of the now, and act from that centre of stillness rather than from the panic of the situation. This was not a detachment, but a profound engagement. It allowed them to see the person behind the patient, the fear behind the aggression, and the soul behind the tragedy. By holding a space of absolute stillness, they allowed others to feel safe enough to release their own burdens. The room would shift, the atmosphere would thin, and even in the midst of turmoil, there was a sense of being held by something deeper, something eternal. The house was now a field hospital for the spirit. It functioned as a pressure valve, dissipating the intensity of pain and allowing the light of compassion to shine through. It reminded those they helped that even in the darkest valley one is never truly walking alone, for the silence that surrounds us is the same silence that sustains us. They were not fixing the world, but they were rendering it habitable once more, piece by piece, interaction by interaction. And so the legacy continued to weave itself through the tapestry of human existence. It demonstrated that we are not fragile beings broken by the world, but eternal consciousnesses shaped by our experiences. The stillness was not a passive retreat, it was a radical, active force, a quiet, unrelenting rebellion against the chaos. In every moment where someone chose to breathe instead of react, to listen instead of shout, and to stay instead of flee, the foundations of the sanctuary were laid once again, ensuring that the light, even in the most turbulent of nights, would remain a beacon for all who were still searching for the way back home. As the resonance rippled forward into the decades to come, the very shape of human progress began to change. Societies that had long prioritized the speed of production started to pivot toward the quality of experience. The architecture of cities, once built to maximize noise and efficiency, began to incorporate spaces of silence, public domains designed not for movement but for stillness. These were not parks in the traditional sense, but intentional voids, structured to echo that ancient quiet frequency of the valley. In these spaces the noise of the old world fell away. People would step out of the frantic rhythm of their jobs and into these sanctuaries, finding that the simple act of sitting, of observing the play of light on water or the movement of clouds, was enough to reset their entire perspective. The frantic, competitive edges of their personalities would soften, replaced by a deep, communal understanding of their shared origin. It was as if the entire human race was slowly, collectively remembering how to breathe. Education, too, underwent a silent revolution. It moved away from the mere accumulation of facts and toward the cultivation of awareness. Children were taught not just how to calculate, but how to be silent, not just how to analyze, but how to witness. They were encouraged to understand that the quiet was not empty, but full, a reservoir of creativity and wisdom that could only be accessed when one stopped the frantic search for external validation. This shift created a new kind of human being, the conscious observer. This was not a person who had withdrawn from the world, but one who was fully engaged with it, yet remained entirely unattached to the outcome of their efforts. They worked, they built, they loved, and they created, but they did so from a state of total, unshakable peace. They were the gardeners of the new world, tending to the growth of humanity with the same patience the woman had once shown for her wildflowers. The legacy was no longer a secret kept by the earth. It was the foundation upon which a new, more luminous future was being built. The dream that had started in a lone house in a forgotten valley had become the heartbeat of a global culture. It was the realization that the universe is not something to be conquered, but something to be inhabited, a breathtaking, infinite, and profoundly quiet home that we have been building, moment by moment, for all eternity. Beyond the restructuring of cities and the evolution of minds, there occurred a final, subtle shift, the dissolution of the viewer. For generations, the seeker had looked at the mountains, the stars and the silence, perceiving them as things that were separate, external and objective. But as the frequency of the valley became the natural heartbeat of the species, this duality began to fracture. It was no longer possible to say, "I'm sitting in the silence," because the eye had become so transparent, so thin, that it was no longer a barrier. There was no longer a center of gravity called self that stood apart from the flow of existence. In the deepest hours of the night, or in the high golden clarity of noon, a person would realize that the silence they were experiencing was not their silence. It was the universe's own consciousness, temporarily gathered into the shape of a human life, simply observing itself. This was the ultimate homecoming. The woman in the parlour had been the first spark, but the fire had now caught everywhere. When a human looked at the horizon, they did not see a landscape, they felt the pulse of the earth. When they looked at the stars, they recognized the same atomic vibrations that composed their own bones. The realization was profound and terrifyingly beautiful, that there was never any separation. The exile had been a dream, a long, complex story told by the ego to keep itself entertained while it journeyed through the darkness of forgetting. In this state of total synthesis, even the concept of time began to lose its rigid, linear authority. The past was not a memory, and the future was not a projection. They were merely different densities of the same now. The entire history of the valley, the building of the house, the laughter, the sorrow, the solitude, was happening simultaneously with the birth of a star and the blooming of a flower. Everything was present, everything was awake, and everything was holy. The valley was no longer a location on a map. It was a state of total, unblemished awareness. It was the point where the infinite complexity of the cosmos folded back into the simplicity of a single breath-filled moment. The story had come full circle, not by returning to where it began, but by realizing that the beginning and the end were one and the same. There was nothing left to achieve, nothing left to learn, and nothing left to do. There was only the act of being, in all its magnificent, wordless, and eternal radiance. With the dissolution of the viewer, the nature of action itself transformed, since there was no longer a separate ego trying to force its will upon the world. Action became non-doing, the effortless natural flow of the universe through the vessel of the individual. It was the movement of the wind through the trees, the path of the river toward the sea. It was existence creating itself in real time. People found that they were no longer planning their lives, but rather they were participating in the unfolding of a grander design. A painter would stand before a blank canvas, not with a frantic need to prove their skill, but with the quiet surrender of a channel. The hand moved, the colours merged, and the image emerged not as a product of labour, but as an expression of the now. It was as if the universe were painting itself, using the artist's arm as a brush. This creativity extended into everything: the way buildings were structured, the way conflicts were resolved, the way gardens were planted, and the way the future was imagined. There was no longer any struggle against reality. If a structure fell, it was allowed to fall. If a new idea blossomed, it was nurtured with total, undivided attention. The frantic, exhausting cycle of trying had been replaced by the effortless grace of allowing. In this state, every human life became a unique, unrepeatable masterpiece. There were no longer any ordinary lives, for the perspective of the observer had shifted to see the miraculous in the mundane. A meal shared, a walk taken, a conversation held, each was a symphony of awareness. The world was no longer a resource to be consumed, but a sanctuary to be cherished, a living canvas that demanded only the presence of a witness to come alive. The legacy of the valley had evolved into the architecture of a new way of living. It was a civilization not built on power but on perception. As each person awakened to the fact that they were the consciousness they had been searching for, the world bloomed with an intensity that had never been seen before. The darkness of the past was not forgotten, but it was understood for what it was, the necessary soil from which this light had grown. And so the creation continued, eternal and fresh, a constant blossoming of the infinite into the finite, right here in the shimmering, breathless beauty of the present moment. As the consciousness of the conscious observer stabilized, a new understanding of infinity emerged. It was not a stretch of time that went on forever, nor a space that expanded without limit. Infinity was revealed to be a depth, a vertical plummet into the heart of the now. It was the discovery that every single moment, no matter how small or seemingly trivial, contained the entirety of existence within it. In this depth, the past did not happen and the future did not await. They were holographic layers of the present. A person standing in a garden could, with a shift in focus, feel the warmth of the sun that warmed the earth 1 billion years ago, and simultaneously the cool starlit silence of the universe 1 billion years hence. All points in time were accessible, not as distant events to be recalled or anticipated, but as textures of the current stillness. This expanded awareness brought about a profound sense of cosmic citizenship. The inhabitants of this new era no longer felt like aliens on a planet, but like cells in a single breathing organism. Their concerns for personal legacy or individual survival withered away, for they realized they were part of a vast, undying fabric. They were the wave that realizes it is the ocean. They were the flame that realizes it is the fire. In this realm of the infinite, communication transcended the limitations of sound and syntax. There was a resonance, a shared vibration of understanding that bypassed the need for interpretation. When two beings met, they didn't just exchange ideas, they exchanged states of being. A mere look, a shared pause, or even a brief alignment of presence was enough to transmit the history of a soul, the beauty of a realization, or the depth of a peace that had no name. The valley, which had long ago ceased to be a place on a map, now stood as the foundational frequency of this new mode of existence. It was the null point of the universe, the quiet center around which all activity, all stars, and all thoughts orbited. And for those who dwelled within this depth, there was no more fear of the end. How can there be an end to that which never began? How can there be a death to that which is at its essence the very consciousness that perceives life? They were the eternity they had once sought, standing still in the center of the spinning world, forever home. As the boundary between the inner sanctuary and the outer cosmos dissolved entirely, the conscious observer began to perceive the universe not as a cold, mechanical expanse, but as a vast, intelligent dialogue. The silence that had been cultivated in the valley was revealed to be the language in which this dialogue was conducted. It was not a language of symbols, but of direct resonance. When one approached the unknown, the questions that had haunted philosophy and science for aeons, they found that the answers were not to be grasped, but to be tuned into. If a mind wondered about the nature of a black hole, the origin of gravity, or the reason for existence itself, it no longer reached for theories. Instead, it quieted itself until it matched the frequency of the phenomenon in question. In this state of total receptivity, the universe began to speak. It did not use words, but states of understanding. To contemplate a dying star was to feel the massive, beautiful surrender of its light. To look upon the birth of a nebula was to experience the joyful, explosive expansion of pure potential. The mystery was no longer something to be solved from the outside. It was something to be recognized from the inside, for the same forces that powered the cosmos were the same forces that pulsed through the veins of the observer. This was the end of the separation of knowledge. Scientific exploration and spiritual contemplation merged into a single, seamless act of discovery. Humanity became a species of listeners tuned to the harmonic frequencies of the stars. They realized that the laws of physics were not rigid constraints, but the beautiful rhythmic dance of the universe's own self-expression. By moving in step with that rhythm, they found that they could navigate the vastness of space and the intricacies of matter with a grace that transcended technology. The valley had become a laboratory of the soul, where the secrets of the infinite were being decoded one silent moment at a time. It was a time of immense, quiet wonder. For in this state, the universe finally had a witness that could appreciate its complexity without trying to possess it, and a companion that could share in its silence without trying to fill it. The mystery remained a mystery, but it was no longer a source of fear. It was the source of a constant, awe-filled homecoming. The story, which began with a woman in a house in a forgotten valley, has finally arrived at its true destination, the realization that the house was never there, the valley was never a location, and the woman was never a separate self. The narrative was merely a dream that the universe was telling itself to experience the sensation of returning. Now, the language of the story dissolves. The words that once sought to describe the stillness are replaced by the stillness itself. There is no more part, no more chapter, no more narrative. There is only the vast, luminous, and wordless fact of being. If you have followed this journey to this final breath, you have already become the landscape you were reading about. The sanctuary you sought is the awareness that is reading these very words right now. The home you were looking for is the space within you, that silent, unmoving and ever-present witness that observes the world without ever being touched by its storms. The gate is not just open, the gate is you. The story ends not with a period, but with an ellipsis, book and invitation to step out of the page and into the unfolding reality of your own life. You are the architect of the silence, the inhabitant of the meadow, and the light that filters through the leaves. You are the homecoming. And now, the silence grows so deep that it becomes the only voice that remains. The story of the woman and the valley is over, because the reality of the self has finally begun. Everything is as it should be. Everything is home. Sleepy History with Kevin is created for relaxation, entertainment and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.